encouraging.
Hello, John.
Hi,
Can you hear me well?
I can hear you very well, thank you.
Great. I can hear you well as well.
That's good. What a lovely studio space you have.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've been here for a while. It's kind of like a live work situation, and it's I call it my gilded cage. I don't really leave very often.
Could I ask you to tilt your camera down a little bit and put yourself more in the center of the frame?
Absolutely. I don't like to
That's
put myself in the middle, but I can do it for you.
no, thank you, thank you. Yeah, it'll
Absolutely.
just look better on YouTube. You have this is a fake forest behind me, but you have lots of beautiful plants. Are they you or your? Are you the plant person or is it your wife?
It's my wife. So I
Ah,
love
okay.
plants, but I used to because I lived in this space before I met my wife, and I'd get some plants and then I would go traveling for a month and then I would come back to, plants that weren't doing super well. So I did not have a lot of plants when she moved in, and she's very big into plants. I love the fact that she takes care of them and brings them in. So
Yeah, yeah. The building looks like it was a previously an industrial space, was it, or is it just that
yeah,
the look of it? Yeah,
yeah. So
nice.
we live at the it's like kind of an industrial. It used to be a brewery, and it was retrofitted into artist lofts. So it's actually one of the biggest artist loft kind of compounds in the world, I think.
Oh,
Um, so it's been here for a while, since the 60s or 70s, I think.
yeah. Why? What is it about breweries that end up being artist places? Because that's not the first one I've heard of. You know, industrial space that was a brewery, but now it's an artist, either studios or spaces like that.
For sure. I mean, it's in the old industrial buildings, high ceilings, windows, things like that, and they just lend themselves well. And I think that it's become more than just artists now. It's become a lot more trendy. But the way you gentrify a neighborhood is you bring the artists in and then raise the rents and then kick the artists out and then you get everyone else in.
Lovely. What a depressing playbook. Um,
I don't know. I try not to take things personally, and I think, it's just kind of the way things work. There's always other neighborhoods you can do, and also the way of things. I feel like it's easier just to learn how to navigate through life instead of, finding it depressing.
well, that's probably wise.
I
All right,
try,
now you try. Okay, well, yeah, don't we all?
right?
Right now, if you're listening, I'm talking to Daniel Bilmes in Los Angeles. Um, do people mispronounce your surname regularly?
Yes.
Okay, good. I thought it was. I had a feeling it might be, but yeah. For I take it, I had to write down phonetically how to pronounce it because I kept saying blinds for some reason. I even when I
Yeah.
sent your thing
Blimes is
through, I spelt it wrong.
yeah, Blimes is the most common mispronunciation. Somehow people switch the I and the L. So
Yeah. Oh, okay.
yeah, I
Well,
like
I
to say it's
feel
like Bill made a yeah, Bill made a mess. So Bill mess.
Bill Mess. Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, and just to give you a time context for our conversation, today's Wednesday, the 11th of January, 2023. How's the new year
All
going
right.
for you so far?
Really well. I sometimes, beginning of a year, you feel almost like kind of underwater a little bit, or too many net resolutions. This year, I really kind of we traveled a lot last year, and I kind of deviated from sort of my normal routine, and it's actually been lovely coming back to sort of the things that I've been doing, but with a sort of slightly newer and broadened perspective. And funny enough, after traveling a lot and kind of doing a lot of deviations from my norm, I realize how much I actually appreciate and like my sort of day to day and how I've sort of created and built my life. And so my sort of resolution and my realization for this year was more of like regathering my inspiration, motivation, not in a different channel, but actually kind of bringing myself back to remembering that everything that I built is actually based on the fact that I wanted to, and it's not forced. And I think that taking back like that, it's I think is why the reason we do things is important. And so I think doing things because you want to do things and feeling, lucky to be able to do what you want is much more powerful than, duty or things that when things start to feel forced.
Wow, you're like the third person I've heard say that. That must be like a thing at the moment. Like a lot of people must be thinking about that.
I think so. I think the last 3 years have been so volatile and there's been so much forced change as well as chosen change that people kept kind of examining what their life looks like and how to change it. And I think that sort of like introspection as well as like, microscope on like what changes should happen has pushed people to make some changes maybe that they didn't even want to make. And so, you go around sort of like change shopping. I think everyone's been doing it where like what change am I making? It needs to be drastic. I'm just not sure in what direction. And I think that like there's like a general fatigue with trying to question everything that you've been working towards for your life. And people kind of are coming some people are making great changes, and I think changes are important a lot of times, but like sometimes the change is slightly different than you thought it would be. And sometimes it's just
Yeah,
a mindset shift or just, a refocus or whatever it is.
yeah. Yeah, great. Now, if someone's listening and they haven't seen your work, how would you describe your paintings?
Funny enough, I usually just tell people to look at the work. I think that, visual, I think of painting almost as like a visual language. And I like people to actually see the language so that, the actual visuals can speak to them. But if I was trying to use words to describe it, it's a fusion of things. I'm very fascinated with textures and abstraction. I came from a very sort of classical tradition, kind of academic background, and so a lot of what I've been doing is trying to like learn how to interpret a lot of sort of modern aesthetics and interesting sort of textual progressions and compositional progressions, and then build them with sort of the more like traditional academic Rolodex and sort of kind of I don't know. It's hard to explain. That's kind of like what I'm saying. It's more of a progression from one thing to the other, but it's art, paintings. I don't really try to use too many, big words to describe what I'm doing. It's one of those things where I actually like the work to speak for itself.
Yeah, yeah, very good. The only thing I would add to that is it's just if you're listening, it's figurative. It's very it's there
It
are
is
people
figurative,
there.
yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. But that's the thing is I actually like to paint the figures differently than people normally would. It's almost like using like a different way of doing something that people have seen before.
yeah, yeah. And then just to put your sensibilities in context, who are your artistic heroes? Are they all painters or does it branch out from that?
I don't have a lot of heroes. Um, I like when I was in studying, Ilya Repin, he was like my favorite artist. He's a Russian painter. And, I can give you a list, like a laundry list of great painters that have impacted me. But I wouldn't necessarily call them heroes. And I don't have a lot of heroes. I actually like to take things from different genres and kind of mix and match. Like I've always read a lot, and so I have favorite authors again, but I wouldn't call them heroes. Like my favorite author growing up was Maupassant, French author, and he died in a mental institution, eating his own shit. So I wouldn't call him my hero, but his understanding of, human interaction and humanity is like borderline unrivaled in my opinion. And I've learned a lot reading his books, but I definitely don't want to end up like him. So, I almost more idolize traits and tendencies, human capabilities, the sort of pursuit of excellence versus specific individuals.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Like
And
I think I like to learn from a lot of different sources, and I find that I'm more passionate about tendencies than people.
right. So would you say that painters have been the main influence on your work?
You know,
Yeah.
Early on, absolutely, by far the biggest, and primarily painters. And then when I transitioned from thinking in terms of kind of skill-based progression to more of a creative progression, my influences became a lot broader. Um, like I definitely back when I was studying and I was younger, I would look at painters, draftsmen, and I would basically find people that I thought were technically the best in history and try to emulate their skill sets. And then the transition from study to actually, trying to create, and we're always still studying. Like I'm still learning every time I pick up a brush or when I'm thinking. That's kind of the big appeal of art is you're never done learning. You can forever progress until the day you die. But the transition from studying and trying to basically put most of my focus on progressing my skill to using my skill to create something, and that transition for me was kind of almost, I feel like it took me a little long because I am naturally such a skill based individual that like I'm obsessed with pure skill progression. And that's actually one of the things that makes me happiest. And that's like I was almost like drawn towards academia early on. But then as an actual artist, as a creator, my position on that changed because I don't think that that's the best thing for an artist to sort of find the comfort of academia or just pure skill and just kind of stay there. I think that actually pushing
Right.
yourself towards areas that are a little bit more uncomfortable, that are maybe not as natural, and then what are you doing with the skill set that you've spent so many years developing? And when I started transitioning from accumulation of skill to the utilization of skill for desired results, that's when I really started looking at a lot of film, photography, anything I could find basically. A lot of literature has always impacted me, but like the visual impacts became very broad, not just the conceptual. And I actually spent like a year or two obsessively looking at imagery, and then I would catalog any image that made me feel something. Like I wouldn't spend too much time figuring out why, but I would actually
Yeah.
build catalogs of imagery that impacted me, and then I would deconstruct why and try to find patterns within the imagery and those catalogs that I found of like all these different types of imagery. Some of it's, film, photography, sculpture, dance, all of it. And it was actually very helpful for me because I started to find patterns. And that's how my sort of like love for texture and love for certain types of, you know, muted color schemes. Like I used to paint with a lot more sort of brash, bright colors. And then I basically was like, why am I avoiding that type of color aesthetic in the stuff that I like? And I'm like, well, because I don't really like super brash loud colors, for instance. And so that was like a aha moment of like, wait, why are you creating something that you're not necessarily partial to? And then there was this big realization that like the most honest work, and I get again, in my opinion, the most honest work would be the work that I would want the most. And so I started looking at things a little bit more personally, like what I want, like how do I want to make this painting? What kind of subject matter would I be interested in? If I was building my ideal, house or mansion or loft or whatever it is, what would I put in my own space that I was designing and creating? And that really helped me sort of narrow down from like an objective kind of like appreciation of the value of the work to a more personal association with an aesthetic.
Yeah. That's a brilliant um, thing that you did of
Thank
like
you.
deconstructing your own, like what you enjoy as a way of sort of narrowing down what you'd create. That's brilliant.
Thanks. Oh, I tend to obsessively psychoanalyze myself. Sometimes
Great.
I actually like taken breaks from that because I don't think it's healthy to do all the time. But part of the way that I've always kind of understood the world is try to understand my own perception and kind of like learn how things work by studying how I interact with things. And I found that like, everyone thinks that they're special and everyone is unique, but it's amazing how similar a lot of patterns are and how, the mind works, how perception works, how we feel, things like that. Like there's a lot of commonality. So I think that if you're good at sort of like pulling yourself out of your, emotional state and actually viewing yourself from a distance, there's a lot to learn there. And it's like a case study in a way.
Yeah. 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 That's brilliant. And how did you end up being an artist? Like, what was your journey to being an artist?
So my father's an artist, and he had a school, an illustration school actually. He was an illustrator for years, and when I was like 8, I was homeschooled my whole life. So for me, it was like this most exciting thing to like go to the like, school, and there was only grown-ups there. And so like from 8, I was kind of started studying with him, and I was like a serious kid, so like I was good at focusing, and I just enjoyed it. And then eventually, he closed his illustration school, and after traveling a bunch, he opened a slightly more like he wanted to build like a more academic school, and that was in Southern Oregon. It was a small school, and I just kind of grew up in it. I think that was like when I was 12 or 13. I was studying for a while with him, and then I started teaching really early. I started teaching when I was like 15. And it was the teaching from an early age was also really helpful for my own development. Again, like learning how to articulate and explain something makes you understand it on a deeper level. And it's almost like your understanding is constantly getting tested.
Yeah.
And, I kept teaching pretty much since I was 15 up till now. I took a little bit of break during COVID, like everyone else, but there was basically like a consistent teaching for most of my adult life. And I feel like it definitely was helpful as well to my own sort of artistic development. And I really enjoy also doing demos and engaging with people. And so the, I don't know, I think the combination of teaching and painting kind of go well together.
Yeah. Yeah. And your mother was creative as well, wasn't she? Or is creative
Absolutely.
as well? Yeah.
Yeah. My parents actually met in New York, and my mom had a full scholarship to Parsons School in Design for fashion, but she was an artist before she went into fashion. And my dad actually, after he immigrated from the Soviet Union, he also went to Parsons and actually met with through a mutual friend while they were both attending Parsons.
All right. So that's such an interesting story. Like to go from being homeschooled without all the sort of social high school kind of dynamics and then go
Hmm.
straight into, well, not straight into, but to, to go through your teens on as part of the faculty rather than, a student.
Yeah.
Because I think what, like I'm guessing that all the people that you were teaching when you were 15 were adults.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember like my first few workshops where I ran them, or like evening classes, where I didn't actually have my dad present, so it was just me basically running a class. And I was curious, it was kind of like, a little like, are they going to listen? Is it going to be like, why is this little shit basically telling me what to do? And yeah, people seemed like pretty receptive. I mean, I definitely got better. I remember when I started teaching, I was very good at pointing out like, things that people needed to work on. And it took me a little bit to understand that it's not just about, explaining what they can improve on, but it's actually like motivation, inspiration. There's a lot of elements to sort of like getting the most out of people and getting them excited about things that aren't solely based on, pointing out their, flaws and things that they need to work on.
Yeah.
But
You were
but yeah,
wielding the sword of truth ruthlessly, sounds like.
yes, in the beginning. Well, I mean, I also that's how that was my whole MO when I was younger. That's like why I love discipline. I liked, hardcore training. I read, 19th century and before like literature. My dad was big in classics, so I never read a contemporary author until I was older. So it was just, homeschooled reading, old French classics and Russian classics and all kinds of other classics. And then basically like, my perception of like what character was it was a bit stoic and brutalist.
Right.
And that helped me evolve, but also it's not necessarily like there's more to teaching than that. And I find that like the most important thing is to bring out the most in someone, in each individual, and people are different. And I think as I taught more and more, understanding who the individual that I'm teaching is and what that individual sort of needs to bring out their own interest or their own strengths. And so my teaching style has evolved more towards being a little bit more specific and more catered to, the individual student versus the sort of this is my system and everyone needs to listen or get out of class type thing.
Very good. Okay, so you're teaching, and what happened next?
So I guess I was teaching, I was studying with my dad, and then I kind of had the run of the school, and I was, started dealing with like administration and kind of running things and building stuff. I used to do a lot of carpentry and construction, so I would like remodel the place and like build the props and kind of, the school kind of became my life. And then basically, my dad actually wanted to move the school to Hawaii. So when I was like 19, I moved to Hawaii, to Maui, before my parents got there, and then we built a school over there. It was kind of like more like agricultural property. So we built like a kind of school barn type structure. And I was there for a few years and then really didn't like the island life. I was also too young, it's one of those things where like I wanted to start my path as an artist and like transition from, the school and academia to like, being a professional artist and, creating gallery work. And I didn't vibe well with. I don't really like the sort of kind of like smaller islands, touristy art scene, things like that. So I moved to LA when I was 21, and it was kind of difficult at first. I went from small town to small town to Los Angeles at 21.
Yeah. Why did
But
you
it was
choose Los Angeles?
so my brother was already here, and then my sister was
Okay.
here, and we had talked for a few years about all sort of congregating in LA. It was like I'm originally from Southern Oregon, so it's kind of like relatively close West Coast versus New York, and you know, there's there's a lot of reasons to come to LA. It's fun. It's La La Land. It's Neverland. It's where every Peter Pan wants to go, but it also has an appreciation for creativity and a sort of like respect for pursuit of dreams and whatnot. And I don't know, I think it's good for, especially if you've grown up in a small town, to like at least go to a city for a while. You don't know what you don't know in a way. And I think it's kind of good to throw yourself in uncomfortable circumstances.
Yeah, no, no. The only reason I ask is that when you talk about your journey, it seemed like New York would have been the next place for you to go. That's why I was
That's fair.
curious about why you went to LA.
Yeah, it's more of like just kind of made sense at the time. I actually always wanted to go to New York for a few years while I was young, but then I kind of fell in love with LA and just never did it. I love New York. I would totally be down to go to New York for a while. I like cities culturally. I also like rural, beautiful places as well. So for me, it's not like the place. I think that you can be happy anywhere. It's more about being happy with yourself. Not
Yeah,
happy anywhere. There's a lot of places I don't want to go to, but there's not like a singular sort of like Shangri-La in my mind. It's more of like, a working model and a place that you like.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so you came to LA, 21.
Came to LA at 21. Had very, very, very little money. And I slept on the couch for a second because my brother and sister, and they had a roommate and they were staying at a place. And it was funny because I was like, I'm gonna teach some classes. So like I made some flyers and started like going to little local businesses because I was still in the analog um, kind of mentality. And the first one, I don't think I got a single phone call or like a single student participant. So I'm like, that's not working. And then it's just kind of one thing or another. I started teaching at a few schools here, and then I taught at Los Angeles Academy of Figurative Art for years actually. Love everyone over there. It was a great school. And yeah, it just kind of one thing led to another. I started sort of like, teaching kind of carried me through the transition.
Right.
And then basically I like when I was earlier speaking about kind of putting myself through the grindstone of kind of analyzing my own aesthetics and my own feelings about
Mm-hmm.
visual languages, that was in LA. And so that's where I came, and there was this like a lot of pressure to do a lot, but then it's like what direction? Because the way that I studied was trying to become very versatile. So like I could paint in a lot of different styles, and I could, do like the brushier, sort of thicker paint, or it could be like super polished and smooth surfaces. But then it's like, which way do you go? And then I wasn't really happy with like emulating a sort of standardized type of aesthetic. I didn't want to be an impressionist, and I didn't want to be a classicist or whatever you want to term things. And coming out of years of like kind of small art school life, I kind of got over everyone trying to defend their abilities by saying it's the best style that there is, or this is the most classically rigorous, or this is the most traditionally accepted, like whatever, like defend their camp in a way. And I basically am like, well, I mean, like this isn't the 1500s. There's so much availability of so many different things, and why not like pick and choose and try to assemble something unique, but not trying to reinvent the wheel. Like why don't we make the best wheel with all of the ingredients we can, taking from all these different genres, and the availability we have to see other work and to see, like we can see more right now from our phone or a computer than people used to be able to, traveling to every single museum. It's not the same thing, right? Like it's not like seeing a painting in person. That's completely different. So there is that, but in terms of like composition, for instance, or just understanding like pictorial rules and things like that, like we can see so much more imagery right now than ever before. And there's so many like, people like, again, growing up in the small art school, everyone's like modernist versus classicist. And
Yeah.
I just don't like that. I'm like, why? Like, why does it have to be us versus them? Why is like, it's not a zero sum game. I think too many people misunderstand things and view life as being zero sum. Like there's one place at the top and we're all competing for it. And in certain things like status is a bit of a zero sum game, but success isn't. And so it's like, I think people that chase status too much kind of get caught up in that. And it's more of the thing is like there's room enough for everybody, and I think that genres and art forms evolve by people interacting and by people actually evolving from each other, and ripping off of things. And I think if it's interesting, why not go for it? And if the resources are there, why not learn from someone that's doing something completely different? Like you might see something that you didn't even think about,
Yeah.
versus defending a specific take or a position.
Yeah. Yeah. You sound like you know what that zero sum game thing is. I've heard it many times and I kind of get it, but you sound like you actually know what it means. Could you explain it to me?
So there's like a really good breakdown. I think his name is Naval Ravikant. He's a venture capitalist, but he's like a bit of a philosopher. He has like a really good Twitter thread on this, and it's basically like the difference between zero sum and positive sum. It's like, for instance, that's where I said status is zero sum. Like if there can be only one world champion, let's say, or there could be you're actually competing with each other for a specific place in a competitive pyramid or hierarchy. Like wealth,
Right.
for instance, it's not actually zero sum. Like you can be wealthy, I can be wealthy, or there's also like like art, for instance. Like it's not like people seem to think that like if someone else is selling, then that might be taking the collector away from them. It's not really how it works. Like it's most things that aren't directly related to status, or that aren't, if you're not competing for like a very finite set of resources, like there's room for everybody. And basically the premise of zero sum versus, positive sum is just that. Like, is everyone competing for the same thing, or is there room for everybody to win? And it's just that
Okay.
simple.
Yeah.
If
Right.
more than
Yeah.
one person can win, then it's not zero sum.
Right. Very good. If more than one person can win, it's not zero sum. That's very helpful.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
it's basically that, yeah. And then like there's and like a lot of like things, and if you really get into societies, like there's something called like like whereas like you're help the more people that are winning, the better, the more of a positive impact for society. So it's
Yeah.
like positive sum has like more of an appeal from a sociological level, almost, because like you're not competing for one place. There's room for everybody to flourish. And I think that's, true. And I think people need to, view things more from that perspective. I think there's like, again, not to get into, geopolitical and kind of like world affairs, but like there's, I think, common misconceptions that people have of like, too many people view the world as being zero sum. And so it's like someone else's success kind of builds like a cringe of like, well, that's taking away from my success, but it's not true.
Yeah. 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 I've always viewed the podcast that way, like,
Totally.
um, I've never sort of felt like, oh no, there's another bloody art podcast. Oh, that's, I've always been
And there'll
like,
be more. I've
yeah,
actually thought of starting a podcast just because I like the genre and I like, the exchanging with people and I like, communicating with people. And it's one of those things I think is great. I think there should be more podcasts. And I think that the fact that the whole podcasting space has blown up is awesome.
yeah, yeah. But well, I always think of it like, you know, like the longest episode I've ever done is 6 hours long, right? That is
Oh, wow.
even at that, that is a small part of an artist's week. That's a day maybe. In the studio. So what about the other 4 days? There's plenty of room for lots more lovely art podcasts, as far as I can see. That's why I regularly have other podcasters, art podcast. If I come across a good art podcast, I'll have them come on in one of the catch up episodes and let everybody know, because I know like the people who listen to the podcast, they're in their studio and they are just like me. They just would love to come across great new podcasts that are, in the area that they're interested in.
Absolutely. I mean, I think content is one of those things where, not in a negative way, but like there's, it's almost like a new fuel or a new sort of like drug or whatever it is. Like people become used to it. Like, people used to like watch one film once in a while. And then, you get TVs at home, you have, people used to rent movies, now they're streaming. And so the availability of content and the sort of habits that we develop and how much we consume has definitely grown. And so it's like I listen to audio a lot when I paint. So it's like, I listen to audiobooks, I listen to podcasts. And so like that sort of appetite for consuming content isn't going away. And so like people are like, well, there is one podcast, another podcast, but you're completely correct. Like people want to keep consuming. It's like fuel. It's like saying that like, if you eat a steak, then you're good for the rest of your life. It's like, no, you're going to want more. And so it's like the industry isn't going away because the sort of appetites are actually growing. They're not diminishing.
Yeah, I find it hilarious. Like if I'm watching a series, and if they don't have all the episodes for me to watch, when I want to watch them, if they do this thing of like dropping a new episode every Wednesday, I'm completely affronted, and which is hilarious because I grew up like
Yeah.
watching TV where you had to be in the room when it was on, and if you missed it, that was
Yep.
it.
Yep. Yeah. We get spoiled very quickly.
Yeah.
It's hard to go
Um,
back.
yeah. What I kind of think, well, that's how it should have been. That's how it should be. Like I feel like, yeah, of course I should have it when I want it, kind of thing.
Oh, for sure.
Um, so how does the idea for a painting start for you? Are you a big sketchbook person? How do you capture your ideas? Do you write? Are you more text based? Photographs? How do you grab those little
Great question.
moments?
Great question. It really varies and it depends. At this point, it's an evolution of past work. It's epiphanies I've had while doing things. It's changes I decided to make when I was super frustrated with a painting. And so it's, this kind of like, it's a evolutionary process. And I'm very passionate about evolutionary processes in general. It's like, how do you gradually improve? How do you eventually reach some, really high point? But it's not like a sudden leap. You're not going to be able to like solve for everything in one specific unique case. It's that gradual progression. And so sketching is very important. I historically have been pretty sloppy and bad at sketching, meaning like I just, sometimes I'm just tired or I don't want to, and I'll kind of vacillate on an idea in my head longer than I should instead of putting it on paper. Um, I've started jotting things down more as remembering the idea. So it's like for me, like the first sketch that I put down is more of a remembering it, right? It doesn't have to be pretty. And that's something I had to like teach myself because, perfectionism is the enemy of excellence in a way. And so it's like, I would got so fixated on making sure that anything I did would look good that I would actually avoid sketching sometimes because I didn't have the energy to make sure that it looked good. And then I was like, that's stupid. Like you should not do that. That's, you getting in your own way. And so even just being able to jot something down that looks terrible, but I can at least recognize what the idea is. It took me a while, funny enough. And, now I just put down ideas on a sketchbook, and then some of those get developed, some of those don't, but I've just learned to just make a note. And I also do the same thing with written word. So it's like, again, I decided when I was, I think, 10 that I didn't like writing. Not the brightest thing to convince your own brain, right? I've read a huge amount my entire life, but like even the fact that I told myself when I was a kid that I didn't like writing actually kind of got in the way of my development in certain parts of my life, because you start to avoid certain things, instead of like, writing something down, you're like, I don't like writing, so I'm not going to write it down. And it's like, that little rebellion, it's funny, but it's not helpful. And so same thing, I'll just try to write something down right now. If I have like a mental, like a thought, I don't do it enough. I'm actually going to try to build some more habits on that type of front, even having a journal next to the bed, because a lot of ideas come right before you go to sleep. And like, do I get up? No. Why? Because I'm kind of an insomniac. I'm like, I don't want to start the gears turning too much. And so self-preservation kept me from writing things down. But the older I get, the more I'm kind of wanting to retrain myself to put the things down and then take them out of my mind, and maybe learn how to, that might help me sleep, knowing that whatever idea I had is safe because it is written down, and I can now forget about it and then come back to it later. So, so yeah, I think habits are really important, and they also tend to fluctuate and evolve. And so the way that I make notes about ideas has evolved as well. And that's kind of where I started the whole premise, with kind of the evolutionary aspect. Um, it could be an image, it could be a thought, it could be a book that I'm reading. A certain arrangement of words triggers some sort of like, idea. And then you try to figure out how to make it a picture. Um, Very often I actually think in terms of pictorial shapes and then turn it, so it's more of a visual idea, and then it sort of transitions into the subtlety of emotion. And so it really just depends. And I think you're going to find a pattern with me. Most of my answers to most questions are, it depends, because I'm very contextual. So it's like the even my humor is very contextual. So it's like the actual context and the variables of the way that the question is framed based on what you're trying to accomplish is how I derive an answer, versus like absolutism type thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's wise.
It gets you in trouble
Uh,
sometimes too, though. Everything does.
have you tried making little voice memos instead of writing down?
Um, I don't really want to listen to them.
Okay.
I'd rather like see a note or something than listen to myself speak. So the voice
Okay.
memo is a great idea. I've thought about it, and I made again. This is me being in my own way. This is kind of what I was saying, like deciding you don't like something. That's something that I'm trying to work on. Where it's like, if it's helpful, use it. Like don't like stigmatize it by like saying it's not your style. So voice memos, I'm gonna try it. Done.
Okay. Well, I was thinking more of that situation where you're sort of a bit bleary and you've got something and you don't want to become too awake to write it down, but you can, grab your phone and mumble something into it that, all gone well, will be coherent in the morning.
I'm gonna. Can I tell my wife that it was your idea? Like me voice recording in bed. I'm gonna be like, it's not my bad, not my fault. John told me to do it. Yeah,
Right. Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Sure. Blame me. Okay,
yeah,
so we've
for sure.
had
I
some
will.
questions come in on social media. This one is from Christine Grace Nagel on Instagram, and she says, "I've heard you interviewed before." She's talking about you here. "I've heard you interviewed before, and very much enjoyed hearing about your process. I'd love some insight into your inspiration and tips on delving more into the conceptual space versus strictly portraiture. Thanks in
Mhm.
advance. Love your work and love your podcast, John." Well, that's great. Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. That's a great question. So a lot of it gets into personal interest in knowing yourself, and that's where like I really kind of move into inspiration is going to be different for different people. And then self-awareness and sort of understanding of even what type of work you're predisposed to create. Like, for instance, I like to move a lot. Like, I like to move, I like to dance, I like to exercise, I like big paintings. Like, I like to physically move paint around. And it's almost like I'll set a certain type of music for the beginning of a painting that is almost like a dance music so that I can get those large movements. And that really kind of inspires me, right? So the actual act of painting is one of my sort of sources of inspiration. And I like to do things in a certain way. And so if I liked different things, my inspiration would be slightly different. Now there's also like the conceptual inspiration. And again, that's very personal. Like what are the subjects that really make you feel something? What are the things that you know, because a painting, like the idea can be easy, but then it can take 300 hours to execute. So it's like, what is an idea or a concept or a composition that you find that passionate, but also what are your patterns that are going to make you interested in pursuing something that takes that many hours, right? Like I get lost in texture. If I didn't like texture, that, you know, those dozens or hundreds of hours would get very old very quickly. And so that's what I've found is like there's a difference between thinking of a specific piece in isolation and then if you're thinking about, you know, the 60 plus hours you're spending at the easel every single week, it's a slightly different type of thing, right? Because you're needing to do so, that interest needs to carry over. And so a lot of it has to do with self-knowledge. I think inspiration goes hand in hand with understanding yourself and with finding things that are conducive to who you are. And the same thing with style. Like I've been thinking about this a lot. Actually, the kind of the theme for my next workshop is going to be personal style development, understanding yourself, and then kind of creating a process that's conducive to who you are. And I think inspiration, as well as subject matter, kind of falls into that general area because and that's kind of the beauty of art in the first place, right? Like there is no standardized source of inspiration. It depends on your own variables and interests and experiences. And, you know, we don't even all view things the same way. Like everyone probably sees color slightly differently. Everyone sees the world differently. And so the kind of most interesting, I think, as well as one of the most difficult aspects of being a professional creative is actually tapping into that and taking it far enough to where you're more passionate about this, whatever obscure point of whatever it is. And because of your passion, because of your interest, because of your introspection, because of how deep you delve, you can then sort of take all of that and show somebody without them working that much something that touches on, you know, your own introspection and study and whatever that is. And so I think that inspiration is very personal. And so after that little monologue, I'll kind of touch on some of my own sort of personal sources of inspiration. And some of it has to do with like it's funny. I've told people like one of my strongest sources of inspiration is the never again motivation. I call it. Like, you know, you find yourself in a place when you're like, never again, this is not happening again. So it's like some of my like best habits of painting came out of like, you know, go start a giant painting without a compositional study. Go do it. See how much you enjoy finishing it. And that's kind of where it comes in. And like I've used to like right after, you know, kind of art school, I would start something and it never got finished because I didn't have enough like whether it's combination of references, clarity of what it was supposed to become. And so like starting something is easy, but like how do you assemble all of the pieces into something you find interesting? And so, you know, learning again, so I said the never again, and then also the I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain like when I see a piece, a painting or a film or whatever, it works or it doesn't. Like or there's things that work and things that don't. And so it's like I genuinely want to make something that like just when I see it, it just feels right. And so it's funny, like I'm over analytical and like obsessively sort of like logical in a certain way. But when it comes to inspiration and art, it's almost the other side. It's a very sort of intuitive, feeling based type thing. Like I want someone viewing this to have like that moment of just like that. It's the feeling comes first to me. So it's not like the technicality of the piece. Technicality should allow you to make something that makes someone feel something, see it. And I think that has become one of my biggest, you know, motivations in creating something is like I want to make something that is kind of honestly my voice, but that makes someone stop and feel, and whatever they feel, it's not like I'm not trying to tell them what to feel, but like it's almost like that intensity, that like moment to think, to try to understand what it is and why, um, motivates me a lot actually. And for me also, just doing a good job has always been like a big motivation. It's simple enough, but like, I chose to do this. I'm probably more critical than my audience. So it's like, again, I just want to be happy with it. So I'm hard to please. So it's like, for me to just be like, okay, all of that crazy effort was worth it is like a huge motivation for me. Like, I want to be like, that's not so bad. Um, and I don't do that often with my pieces. Like, I usually am like, I don't like them.
Right. Even when they're finished.
I like them like years later. Like,
Yeah.
I
Right.
usually, so it's like it's or years or months or whatever, but like yeah, usually like when it's done, I just like look at the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it, and I was like, that wasn't as elegant as it should have been in its creation. Like I'm almost chasing that elegance of creation. Like this is good. I'm actually like psychoanalyzing myself again. It's like I like like almost like an elegant dance where every single brush stroke, almost like without even thought, kind of came into existence the way it needed to be. Where I'm like
Hmm.
flow state, like I'm kind of obsessive with flow state, and I love the actual process of creation. Almost like I love finished pieces, but like I adore sort of personal evolution and the process of creation and how to be in that flow state and to actually almost like channel something and to make something that you didn't even know you could and like not sure how it came about. But it's almost like consciously training your subconscious and then creating something with almost that subconscious that is something that is its own entity that you didn't completely plan on either.
Yeah. Do you actively or consciously get yourself into flow state, or do you just recognize it after it's happened and you're just happy that it happened?
It used to be a little bit more haphazard. It's become a little bit more consistent, but it also like not all the time. So it's like I actually like last year kind of had dealt with a bit of burnout. And there was not a lot of flow state. Like it was like a little bit forced. Like I've recognized like there's also like refilling your reservoirs, getting enough rest, getting out of broadening your perspective, broadening your horizons a little bit, seeing new things. Like you have a finite amount of inspiration in you, and that also runs out. So it's not like you can just learn how to do something and chain yourself to an easel and like be inspired for 60 years. Like some people maybe have done it, and like you can find inspiration from your work that you then apply to the other work. But personally, I find that if I'm you know like exercise is really big for me. So it's like exercise, like if I'm physically feeling good, if I'm moving well, like the actual movement. So I'm saying like dance, I find that very sort of conducive to flow state. Like the way that I actually move, or like there's a certain way of painting which I find like I call it like swagger almost. Like when I'm painting from like a place of like complete confidence, then it's easier to also get into sort of the flow state. But like again, how do you get to the point where you're able to paint with such confidence? It's like a lot of trial and error. So it almost is like a progression to till you get to flow state. And for me, flow state is when everything kind of comes together. And so that's one of my favorite aspects of being a creator is like spending years building separate pieces and then eventually watching it come together into something, like again spending a bunch of effort to make something in a moment in time be very effortless.
Yeah. Yeah. There are people who've like figured out how to get you into flow state, like how to get yourself into flow state. I know of them, but I never studied it or anything like that. But that's why I was asking you, like, have you approached it in that way?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I can do it pretty consistently for a chunk of time. What happens, like, when you try to like spread it too thin, is eventually it becomes a bit forced. So it's like, if you want to do, let's say, 3 to 6 hours a day, I can pretty much flow state that. If you're working deadlines and you're, 12 hours a day in there, it's more of like, it's almost like a mania. It transitions from
Yeah.
flow state to mania.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
does. And then it's like, it's obsessive. It goes from flow state, and then I transition to obsessive compulsive, where it's
Right.
like I don't know what I'm doing. I can't stop myself. I just can't, like, I'll walk away from the easel, go downstairs to eat, and then suddenly I'm in front of the easel. I don't remember how I got there, what the sort of like reasoning behind it was, and I'm doing something. And I'm like, what are you doing? And I'm like, is it good or is it not? I don't even know at the time, but it basically, like, if I try to run flow state endlessly, it transitions into obsessive compulsive for sure.
Yeah, right. And just going back to Christine's question then about sort of expanding the classic kind of portraiture to include more conceptual, the conceptual side of things.
Hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So again, portraiture or figurative aspect let's just clarify, it's people being in the piece, in the paintings, right? But that's like it's very specific, but it's also like the, utilization of that is very broad, right? Like you could have a small figure in a large landscape. You could have a close up with a small, like, we're getting into like kind of classical genres, right? Like a lot of like old Renaissance portraits, they had like the sort of little background, large head, but like, some like just general little, Tuscan countryside behind the shoulder, or some castle or a portrait or a wall. And that's where you get into sort of the traditional genres. The human experience is something I'm very interested in, right? Like art is made for humans. So it's like we are part of the reason that, or the main reason that art even exists it's like we're basically every single piece of artwork in a way is a human experience. Um, and so I like to have humans in them, in the pieces themselves, again, for multiple reasons. I find it interesting, but also I just like love painting forms. It's a very, and then like human faces are such a good way to convey emotion because we all associate with, humanity because we're human. Um, but that's where, like, humans are characters in a story, if you may. And the every single painting is a window into a world that you're creating. And so it gets into what kind of world do you want to create? Like what world that's a fantastical world or whatever, because it is made up in a way. Even if you're doing a rendition of reality, it's still a new world and a new entity that you're creating. And so what is, if you want to have, figures in a world that you're creating, what is the world that you want your humans or your creations to inhabit? And is it a sort of literal world? Is it a sort of, is a mass of shapes and textures? Is it three-dimensional? Is it flat? Like that's kind of where it gets into, again, very personal. I love the interaction of sort of faces and abstraction and, the way that things interact with the face. Like I'll do a lot of veils, a lot of, flowers in front of faces with casting shadows. Like I really enjoy the interaction of the figure with the environment, and in a sort of up close and personal way. So it's like, I tend to gravitate towards those types of things. I love the texture of hair, and like a lot of times I'll really play on that a lot more and get into the hair turning into the environment. I think a lot about like almost like these characters are wanderers in this sort of world of abstract forms and textures that are utilized to convey emotion, and so it's kind of like, again, just the way that my brain works and kind of how I see things. And so I move towards abstraction versus, let's say, a story-based narrative of, a landscape and people interacting in that landscape. And again, that varies. Like I've actually, when I do sort of more landscape environments, I still translate them into sort of like a unique textural type of thing because, again, it's something I'm passionate about personally. And
Yeah.
so I would recommend really sort of like like one thing I did actually, now that I'm remembering, is I did a series of pieces. I think I spent like a year or two not painting figures in my work because basically what happened when I, transitioning from kind of academia and art school to producing work, is I realized that I would paint the figures and then everything else was an afterthought, and I wanted to change that pretty drastically. So I did a series of animal paintings actually, and I started using gold leaf and silver leaf, and I did like a whole series actually. So it was like a year or two where I didn't paint figures, and that was helpful. So actually, like a good exercise is make a few paintings without a figure in them,
Right. Yeah.
and see where you go.
That point you made about the painting being like a window into the world and then think about what world you want to create. That's gold.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so
Sa-
I actually really I like sci-fi, fantasy, and all kinds of like esoteric writing too, because like it pushes me into like that whole world building. It's like a lot of like more creative pieces I've done. I've actually like listened to other people like like writers building their own worlds, and like that's where I get a lot of inspiration as well.
right. Yeah. Yeah. Sam Wilbraham on Patreon, thanks for the tea, Sam, says, firstly, John, as ever, your work for this podcast is greatly appreciated. Love listening to each of the interviews. Hope Patreon is keeping the kettle on. Daniel, your aesthetic is great, instantly recognizable as yours. What do you use as reference for your paintings? Do you compose anything digitally, or is it straight out of your head onto the canvas with preliminary studies?
Great question, and I actually get that question a lot. It's a lot of things, and I'll be like completely transparent. A lot of my aesthetics stylistically came out of life studies. So like I was, as I said, teaching for years and studying for years. Like I spent like 8 years in my dad's art school doing, like I would only work from life up until my 20s actually. Like I refused to work from photography. And then when I started working from photography, it was terrible. It was like horrible paintings, horrible references, because that's also a skill set, like understanding how to shoot references and how to light them and what you're looking for in a reference, which reference is going to work, which one doesn't, and then also having enough sort of life studies in your arsenal so that you understand form and structure, and then you put it all together to create something. And so the sort of stylistic approach that I've sort of taken recently came out of a lot of demonstrations and charcoal drawings that I did for years. And then I realized at one point in time that my charcoal drawings I preferred to my paintings. And I was like, wait a second, I like my drawing better, like significantly better. And I'm like, okay, how do I translate what I'm doing with charcoal into paint? And so like a lot of my stylization and experimentation, and then I started working with acrylics, and I would do these like scratch board type stuff and like work with these tonal acrylic stuff. And actually, one of those experimental pieces of me trying to translate my drawings into paintings, that was the first piece that Steve at Arcadia actually saw, that he was like, invited me for a show. He actually thought it was a drawing, and it was like a mixed media piece. And the funny thing is like as soon as I actually started experimenting with taking what my favorite aspects of my work and translating it and like growing on that and like really evolving the stylistic elements, that's what actually resonated with the galleries as well. And so it's a progression of things, as most things are, but like it really the aesthetic came out of life studies. And then once I sort of became a little bit clearer with what I was doing and how, I do shoot references, I do preliminary drawings, and once I kind of have a general sketch or concept, I do a reference shoot usually. I'll also sometimes do a live study. If it's a simpler pose, I'll have someone actually pose there and, do like a quick study. And then I'll also do like a reference shoot, and I put it all together. And I also do a lot of progression based on previous paintings. Like the longer I've been at it, the more I've like started taking some of my favorite smaller paintings and kind of using them as a reference and trying to use that as a reference for a larger piece. So it's like some of my bigger pieces are almost like constructed from the parts of some of the smaller ones. And so it's all of it as much as possible and whatever I need to try to, accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish.
Yeah, yeah, that's brilliant. It's almost like fractals. This. I mean, it's not exactly fractals, but the idea of
Totally get what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's
And go ahead.
No, no, you go ahead.
I was going to say, and if you are shooting references, which eventually becomes inevitable, how you shoot, the way that you light, the quality of the imagery, like all of that matters. And like what kind of lighting you're even going for. And that should be based on like an understanding of what you're trying to do. So it's like I wouldn't recommend like blindly searching for some sort of image to make a copy of as a painting. But like if you're clear on what you're doing, photo references can be very valuable, especially in, today's day and age. You don't have like serfs that'll pose for you for like, a meal a day endlessly. I mean, it's a good thing, obviously, human rights and whatnot. But you have to, especially if you're working, you're doing figurative work and, you're spending long hours in the studio, you want to do some stuff, like it's a very helpful tool, but you kind of need to be clear about what you're doing, and photography doesn't change that.
Yeah. And do you do any Photoshop type compositing or alteration or anything like that?
I do use Photoshop, yes. Actually, I also have a Patreon. I do a lot of this type of like specific explanations of my like techniques and such on my Patreon. I upload videos, but I basically recently did one where I actually did an abstract. Like I started a panel, and I do like this like gradual layering of different gesso and then acrylics, and it creates sort of like almost like an environment. And so like I like to create a abstract sort of subtle environment before I paint the figures in. And this time I created the environment and then I brought it into Photoshop. And then I composed it, the references on top of an image of the panel just to see how it all fit. And then I basically came back to the panel. So I go back and forth. I don't do a lot of like subtle color adjusting and stylization in Photoshop. I like to do that with the paint. And I actually find that like I don't like to copy. I hate copying. So I use references to like inform the work. But what I again, it's just personal. Like my dad likes to have like do all of the work in Photoshop basically. But like I like to sort of assemble things and hash out compositions in Photoshop sometimes. But I definitely leave the like subtle color arrangement, things like that, to the paint. Because like part of how my colors happen is the way that they're actually created. Like it's the layers and the glazing, things like that. It's like more of like a alchemical process versus like that's the color and then I try to match it and then put it on. Like the colors usually come out of like the multi-layered approaches. They're the glazes and how they interact and the way the pigments actually kind of create this magic that I find very interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
but if I'm working a large painting and it's like a multi-figure composition, for instance, I will do a drawing study. Then I will do a Photoshop mock-up after I put all the references together. Then I'll do a small painting. And I'm working from the drawing as well as the Photoshop mock-up. And then when I'm actually enlarging it and doing the final large piece, I work from all of them, but the most I'll actually reference the smaller painting.
All right. Have you started to use AI for referencing, creating references for models?
I actually have never played. I haven't played with the AI generator yet at all. I probably should.
Okay.
Again, it's been like I don't know. I feel like everything now is like in these coordinated fads where people are like, there's the subject matter that everyone's talking about. It was NFTs, now it's AI. Um, Again, I'm sure there's going to be some questions about AI and my position on it. Like, honestly, there's I think two ways of you can kind of, or not more than two ways, but like there's two general ways people kind of look at stuff like, evolution of technology and humanity and human thought or whatever as a positive, right? Like we're growing, we're reaching to these new abilities and potential. And then there's like, oh, that's not helpful to people in the industry that are, like there's, obviously like this gray area with copyright and, the AI is like, AI learning versus the actual utilization of, the AI understanding. And so it's like from like a learning perspective, it's obvious that like it's learning from a bunch of stuff that is copyrighted. So again, it's a big subject that I don't really want to get into too deeply, but if art survived the camera or painting survived the camera, it'll survive AI. Like it's one of those things where, people have been in art. How many times in the last 100 years has an artist or an art critic come out with the statement that painting is dead? Like it's happened all the time. It's still happening. Like I went to a show right before COVID, and there was literally I have a picture of myself standing like this next to a big art installation that says "Painting is dead." So it's like it's nothing new where people are worried. Now, if you're specifically in like the concept art industry where you're making digital work, I could see people being like a little like, AI is generating something that looks like your work, and it's like it can be uncomfortable. And I'm not saying I agree with that at all, but I more look at things like why do people buy art and what is the value of art, right? It's not finite. Like there's people are actually appeal to the human element of art. Like, and that's where I kind of come back to like art is a human creation. And so it's like you could have something imitate that or maybe make something for a use case, let's say, like a storyboard or something that's, used or some sort of like character creation or whatever, that might actually impact an artist negatively, which I don't appreciate, obviously. But at the same time, I don't think that it's gonna supplement the human element in art because I think that's the whole point
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're dead right. I mean, if you only have to think of like hyper realistic paintings, what if people didn't appreciate the craft and the human element in that, they'd just buy very focused, sharply focused photographs. They
Oh,
wouldn't
for sure.
bother
It's not
buying
even
a
just
hyper
that. It's
realistic
like
painting.
I've had print releases where it's very, very similar to the original, and the original sold. And I will have someone ask for the original and not want the print. And like it happens all the time. And so it's like and I completely get it. Like I actually, you know, also prefer originals to prints, like massively. Like it's not the same thing. And so it's like, but I've seen prints that are amazing, and I've made some prints. And I'm like, wow, that's actually pretty similar. So it's like it's not just about like what you get for the money, right? It's actually it's what I'm saying. Like the way that I like to paint and the paintings that I like the most, like where you actually see the process of creation in the finished product. So it's not like it's like a smooth, completely rendered thing that like looks like an image. Like I don't like that. If you actually see my paintings up close, like you can see 6, 8 layers. When light hits it, it's different in different lightings. Like it actually has its own life. It's not like it's not dead. It's alive, if that makes sense. And so yeah, I think that like people were, like so I'm saying everyone was talking about NFTs, 2 years ago or a year ago, and it was the only thing like is traditional art dead? Like and NFTs like the only sort of form, and I'm saying like now, like the funny thing is AI probably most affects the same people that were blossoming in the age of NFTs. Things are just moving so quickly right now, and that's why I think that like getting too attached to fads or like the subject matter that's in the news at the time, when it is, I think it's like kind of distracting. I don't think people should worry so much about what people are talking about at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Donna Cowan in Canada says, "Are you using the traditional rabbit skin glue and white lead primer? I noticed the reddish brown drips on the sides of the panels. Would they be glue?"
No, I don't use rabbit skin glue. I actually work on rigid surfaces because I do a lot of sort of removing paint as it's drying. So like I'll scrape into it with palette knives and even like little pins. I put a push pin into a pen. So like I do like a lot of scraping. So I work on aluminum or wood, and the drips are actually from the acrylic layers that I do. I'll usually do like after I size it and gesso it, I'll do like these thin acrylic washes with a squeegee. And so like as I pull the squeegee, that's what drips over. Um,
Okay.
Rabbit skin glue, again, it's totally a reasonable thing to use. It's like one of the most time tested in like and like the leads and things like that. Like I use lead white, but I don't like to prime with lead because I use acrylics. So you can put oil over acrylic, but you don't want to put acrylic over oil. It's a very bad idea. So once I start working with oil, everything after that is oil. But before that, I actually come in with acrylic, and so I don't work on an oil primer for that reason.
Yeah. What does the drawing phase look like when you've made your small painting and you're about
Mhm.
to put it, do the bigger version of it? How does that go?
It's a good question. So I've done a few drawing transfers in the last 5 years, but most of like 99% of my paintings, um, there is no transfer. I use like a tape measure to do like a few sort of like transitions of points, like where the bottom of the head is, and I actually do all of it freestyle. Um, Again, why do I do that? Because I like I'm a sucker for self torture, obviously, but It's actually because I like the spontaneity and the way that I scrape the paint. Like I'm not coloring in the lines. I'm actually like the first brushstroke I try to make is like the longest brushstroke, right? And so I actually move things past and into each other and like push in. And I like intentionally will paint out a little bit too much, and then I wipe back in. So it's like it's a very sort of adding and subtracting type of process. And so I'll usually work in sections. So like for instance, if I have like a three-figure painting and I have a small mock-up of it, I will, let's say, paint like the one of the figure's head in one day, and then the torso the next, and then so on and so forth. And it takes like, I don't know, 70% of the time or 50% of the time to actually just gradually do the first pass in all the places. And then fusing it all together takes a while. Um, I've been flirting with doing a little bit more of a transfer just because it does save some time. But I like the spontaneity and like the originality of the nuance when I just don't even have a drawing transfer. What I do is like, let's say the preliminary is 12 by 24. I'll sometimes make, and I've done this before, where the large final painting is, let's say, three times that. Like instead of 12 by 24, I'll do like 36 by 72. And so it actually translates, like 1 inch here will translate to, or let's make it simpler. Let's say 12 by 24 turns into a 24 by 48. I can run my tape measure to a point and say if it's 2 inches here, it'll be 4 inches there, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So it's like an easy way to just use like a tape measure to actually, or ruler to find reference points. So like if you want to know how big the head is here, you can sort of find where the bottom is here, just double it, and then you'll find it there. So I'll do that.
Yeah.
But I don't actually do transfers.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah. I saw in one of your time lapses the tape measure. And I thought, oh, that's unusual. So yeah, very good.
Yeah. So, and if I'm doing something smaller and I'm being lazy and I don't want to do a preliminary, I'll sometimes set up a grid in Photoshop where it's basically like every 2 inches or something. And then I can use that reference point, and then I'll use a tape measure on my panel just to find, let's say, like where the outside of the eye is. And so I pull from the outside. And if it's, 2 inches on the grid, it'll be 2 inches on my paint.
Yeah. 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 Very good. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, God, I'm really enjoying this podcast. I've listened to a few now and they're brilliant. And there's so many of them. And I've learned so much from listening to them. And you know what? If I met that John Dalton fella in real life, I'd love to buy him a cup of tea and have a chat with him. I'd love to do that every month if I could. Well, now you can. The tea part at least, because this podcast runs on cups of tea bought for me by people like you who listen to the podcast and send me the price of a cup of tea once a month through the Patreon account. That's patreon.com/John Dalton Gently Does It, all one word. And if you're one of those people who already send me cups of tea through Patreon, thanks a million. The tea is lovely and I really appreciate it. Now, the great thing is that if you can't afford to send me the price of a cup of tea, or you don't want to, that's fine. You still get exactly the same podcast for free. It's sort of an honor system where the people who can afford it and want to pay for the people who can't or don't want to. So it's all lovely. So if you'd like to send me a cup of tea once a month, you can do that through Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. It makes a huge difference to me. Negin Mosheni Najed, sorry about that, on Instagram says, thanks a million to John. You're welcome. May I ask 2 questions, please? Yes, of course you can. Number 1, how do you tone your surface and what's your surface? ACM? Question mark.
So sometimes aluminum, sometimes I do a lot of cradled wood panels too. I like the slight subtle texture of the wood. I really do. It's also like one of the, oldest, most archival surfaces as well. I tend to, again, I have a video on my Patreon sort of going over the prepping process because it's pretty time intensive. I'll usually do like a series, like a group of panels at once because it takes me like 2 days to prep. And, it makes more sense to do like 6 or 10 of them at a time. And it's basically, you have to size it if you're working with oil. And so I usually use shellac to size it. And then I'll do multiple coats of gesso with some light sanding, and then I actually do the acrylic stage. And again, it's pretty, time intensive to go through all of it. But the acrylic, I use a squeegee to actually pull it, and I use different mediums, which kind of creates like a really interesting subtle texture surface that I like, but it's also smooth. And so, like, people ask a lot about how I achieve the results that I do texturally and aesthetically. And again, this is where it gets into understanding yourself, understanding style, because I spent a lot of time experimenting on how to prep surfaces because I was very clear on what I wanted the surface to do. Like, I like there to be a little bit of tooth and absorption, but not too much. And I like it to be pretty smooth so I can actually, because my paintings are actually pretty smooth. They look sculptural, which is kind of what I like about it, but it's not like I don't use a lot of thick and pastel brushstrokes at all. And so the tool that you're using to apply something and the surface, they're working together, right? Like if you have a super rough surface, the same tool is going to make a very different mark than if you have a very smooth surface. And so people think about, the tool that makes a mark, but the surface is just as impactful on the mark as the tool that you're using to make it. And so it's really a fusion between, again, what you're using and the surface and what you're trying to accomplish. Which again, that's like a lot of art is finding these different things that impact each other. And so the way I prep is very specific to the tools I like to use and the sort of textures that I'm trying to accomplish. But generally, it is smooth-esque, and it's rigid. Like I have worked a lot on linen as well. These days, if I do work on linen, I use a rigid back to it. So it's like it'll be a panel, and then I actually stretch the linen over the panel instead
Okay.
of having it, you know, more loose.
Very good. And then the second question is sometimes you use a tool that makes an interesting texture. What's that tool and how do you make your oil painting so smooth and liquid to be able to work with that tool?
Great series of questions, and it's funny because I didn't actually know what the second part to that was going to be, but I already kind of touched on it. Is like the surface and the tool. It's more of a dance. They interact together. It's not like one works without the other. So I'm gonna reach over here. This tool is it's like a rubber wedge. It's actually just rubber. So it's kind of like it goes back to like I use larger squeegees for early surfaces, and
Yeah.
then these also make unique textures because of the way that the subtle layers of paint have dried on them. So like I almost call it seasoning. It's like seasoning a cast iron.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
it's like the tool when it's fresh, it's completely smooth. So it's mostly going to wipe paint, and then as it sort of builds up the texture, there's going to be slightly different surfaces. But again, the surface and the way you prepare the surface has just as much impact as the tool itself.
Yeah.
So in essence, it's straight edged rubber tools is what I'm using to pull and push the paint around. And the way that I get it kind of thinner and more malleable for spreading is oleo gel. It's a medium by Rublev. I think Natural Pigments, Rublev is like the same brand. And
Hmm.
oleo gel is the medium that I primarily use.
Yeah. Is that actually an artist tool or is it something you have turned into an artist tool?
The rubber stuff,
Yeah.
it is an artist tool. It's I think these are called catalyst wedges, but they are artist tools. I don't know what they're supposed to be used for. Like, and I actually have like a bunch of different types of rubber tools. I also have used some rubber, like I've also gotten other types of rubber and actually cut my own tools. So it's you don't have to use like it's mostly just spreading stuff around in
Yeah.
essence. So it's you can use just about anything, but like the most sort of standardized thing that people can purchase in an art supply store would be like the catalyst wedges.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Sylvie Carter in Australia says, love your podcast, John, and the super chilled interview atmosphere you create. Oh, thank you, Sylvia. Sylvie, my question for Daniel is, what tools is he using, such as the blue and white pencil-like tool I see him drawing with?
So funny enough, the blue and white tool, I'm actually looking at it right now. I was like, which one? It's a pen, like a big pen that I took the inside out and then I took a push pin and shoved it in there. And then the white part is a paintbrush that I pushed on the other side. So what it basically is, it's a scratching tool. So it's like a
Yeah.
push pin. I'm just kind of scraping into it. And I do that when the paint is tacky. So like when it's not fully dry. Like I'm not scraping into completely dry paint. And I'm also not scraping into totally wet paint. Um, my techniques that I've kind of developed, I'm actually doing different things at every single stage of the as the paint dries. So when it's completely wet, I'm basically focused on adding paint. And so like I'll intentionally put on almost too much paint. And by too much, I don't mean like super thick, but like I'm very sort of, again, I kind of touched earlier on like the swagger. Like I throw paint around, like it's full body movement, no hesitation, like not overthinking it. And then as it's drying, I start to remove, but also move paint. So it's like I call it almost Robin Hooding, take from the rich, give to the poor. I'll take from like the areas that are too dark, I'll actually lift a little bit of it, and then I put that same paint in areas that are too light. And so a lot of what I'm doing as the paint is drying is I keep lifting from where there's too much paint and putting it where there's too little. And so like that's like think of 1,000 of those adjustments, and that's where a lot of that subtlety comes through. And then after that stage, after it's not like lifting with a paintbrush, I can still scrape a little bit of it off with a pin. And so that's the super subtle adjusting
Mm.
stage where it's like it's tacky. You can't make a lot of changes, but you can still lighten a little bit. And so that's where I'll come in with the pin and I'll remove a little bit of the paint.
Mm. Wow,
And I
that
basically keep adjusting it until it's dry.
right. Yeah, that just reminded me of the story of there's a famous Chinese painter from I don't know, a couple of 100 years ago, and his process was he would get really drunk
Mm-hmm,
and attack his the blank canvas, and
mm-hmm,
just like pretty much destroy it, not actually destroy it, but it'd be just a big mess in his studio be wrecked. And then the next
mm-hmm,
morning he would come in, or when he was sober, and clear-headed, no hangover, and then he would take what he had done, and then he would start to fine-tune it and make the painting out of the
totally makes
marks
sense to me.
that
Yeah.
he made. Yeah, it's a beautiful story of like it always stuck with me of this combination of these two things. And just when you were describing how you start, it just really reminded me of it.
So I totally resonate with that. I try not to do, bring like liver damage into my daily process, but it really is kind of similar in a way where it's like I'm channeling something different when I'm throwing paint around than when I'm calibrating. And like I also enjoy the fact that I can sleep between the stages a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, the fact that I throw paint around and then I walk away before I'm like over adjusting. Like sometimes when I work too late, like I'll be like the last 2 hours, I'm like, you shouldn't have done that.
Hmm.
Now, sometimes I'm just thinking that because, at that time you're tired. You're like, it's all terrible. Why are you doing this? Why did you decide to be an artist? This is a terrible idea. It's a terrible career, and all that. But minus the sort of late night sort of thoughts, the ability to actually like strut, do your confidence thing, really throw paint around with no hesitation. And then before you start overthinking it, kind of leaving it for a second and then coming back the next day. And I love the second day, the consistency of the paint. Like it's still wet, you can still remove it, but it's a little tackier, so it's a little stickier. And so you can move it and it won't take all of the paint away, but it'll take some of it away. So like you have more options, right? Like you can completely remove it, you can remove half of it or a third of it, or you can also add. So like your Rolodex, if anything, is almost bigger when it comes to adjusting on the second day.
Yeah.
The first day, when there's nothing there, is the easiest to just to do the larger movements, right? To really throw the paint around to create sort of the foundation of everything. And
Yeah.
that sort of separation of adding to adjusting, because the first day is only adding. Like I won't stop. Like I'm not trying to fine tune. And when I do, I don't like those starts as much. The starts I like the much is where I call it almost like biting off more than you can chew and then just dealing with it. And it's
Yeah.
basically like, and it's almost like the fast pace type of thing too, where I paint better if I'm not overthinking it. Again, it kind of goes back to the whole dancing and swagger. And basically like there's no hesitation, and I'm just throwing paint around almost casually. I mean, it's not casual, it's very hyper focused. I'm usually exhausted after the first day. The first day is by far the most exhausting. Um, but it's a, and that's where kind of like flow state intuitive type of painting comes in, where it's like I am not over analyzing, I'm just really going for it. Second day, third day, and eventually like the middle stages of a piece is where I start over analyze and start to hate it. um and then it's like it's usually like the beginning, you're like, this is going to be amazing, right? And like you need to, you want to feel that way, right? You want to feel like clear and confident. And then the middle 90% is just like, why? This is usually like I don't like it, and then it does come together in the end. um so yeah, the over analysis, I try to keep it before I start a piece, and then when I'm finishing it, not in the early stages.
Yeah.
There's a certain freedom that I like in my work, and the only way I found to like really maintain it is to like attack the beginning with like energy and just kind of go for it and just have fun with it almost.
Yeah. Sylvie has a second question. She says,
Mhm.
there is a super sculptural quality to his work. Is that something he thinks about when creating the texture? I love his work.
Thank you. I do think about it a lot. And I also, as I'm saying, I'm like a sucker for punishment. So, I like to gather all of these sort of like textures and forms, or textures and shapes into forms. And so it's like again, like one of the things I feel passionate about and I feel kind of uniquely qualified to do is to translate some of these more abstract things into actual articulated forms. So it's almost like I'm building forms in unorthodox ways with unorthodox textures, but I'm still building forms. And so, again, it's coming from even like my academic background and like liking to articulate the form. And, again, even my dad, he's from ex-Soviet Union. The Soviet schools were all about form and three dimensionality in the work. And reality is three dimensional. Two dimensions is like a translation almost. And so like even though I'm creating something in 2D, like the sort of illusion of the third dimension, again, I think it adds depth. It literally adds depth. So yeah, I enjoy it, and it takes extra time and effort to articulate things three dimensionally for sure, because it's almost like taking abstraction and applying rules of physics to it, like, or the rules of light in a way, and like the way that light travels over the form, and it all has to work together and be cohesive, which takes extra time.
Yeah. 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 Brilliant. Um, so is there a, I'm just trying to get a better idea of, what the actual painting process is like. Is there a grisaille phase? Are you consciously doing glazes, or is it mostly alla prima, or it sounds like a sort of a mix of it all, is it?
It is totally a mix of it all. Yeah. I've so smaller pieces, like if it's 16 by 16 or smaller, I have done it alla prima, but it doesn't look like alla prima at all. And alla prima, I mean like a 4-day bender. Like I used to do actual benders where it's like 16 hours, you roll into bed for a few hours, you roll out of bed and you go to the easel. And there's like, no, that's actually kind of why I dealt with a bit of burnout. Like I was so motivated and so kind of inspired, in the last few years, that I definitely overworked, which is also like, there's a difference between sprinting and marathon running. And I'm naturally a sprinter. And so like I took that sort of type of like, burn candle at both ends type of mentality, which helped me produce a lot of work in a short time span. But it's also like not necessarily sustainable. You can keep producing great work. You just need to be, realistic with energy reservoirs and things like that. But my alla prima isn't done in a session. It's basically done as the paint's drying. So it's like with a little bit of medium or a decent amount of medium, and when the studio's cold, the paint won't fully dry for a few days. And so like maybe 4 or 5 days. And so like I have done smaller pieces where I'm scraping into it, and then also, as it's almost dry, I'm also adding paint into it. So there's still multiple layers in certain areas, but it comes about more alla prima. Um, Normally, though, I basically do parts that are almost alla prima, and then other areas will have 5 subtle glazes on it. Sometimes it's like 10 glazes in certain other areas. So I don't cover the entire surface of the painting the same way. And that's part of what I find super interesting, where you're almost seeing the way something's made in the finished product. And like a lot of the way that I sort of stylize is leaving certain areas and designing the painting to where some areas are going to be finished in a more simplified way. Let's put it that way, because it's still finished because it's intended to be that way, right? But I simplify certain areas a lot more, and then other areas I'll gradually build up into like a completely three-dimensional and articulated type of focal point. And so it just depends on sort of how many layers it's going to take to get the desired effect. So it's almost more like I plan things as almost like a military campaign, and some areas are just going to take 10 layers, and some areas I'm going to be very careful in the first pass because I want it to come through in the finished product. And so it's a fusion of all of those things, you know, all the prima, a lot of layers of glazing. I also like to use lead white in the um, certain areas, and I like the way lead white looks when it's glazed over a warm underpainting. And then, you know, 4 or 5 subtle layers of lead white gives it like this luminosity that I really, really love. Whereas one layer of lead white looks kind of terrible. So it's like one of those things where it's like if I'm just trying to like, you know, do a little whiteout type thing, you don't need lead white. You don't want lead white. It's using a toxic, dangerous material for no reason at all. But if you want to get sort of, you know, a certain luminous effect in the skin tones, then you can plan how to do so. And that's basically, if you know, and that's where the grisaille does come in, because, you know, a slightly warm underpainting gives it the basis. And then as you start to layer the lead white, and I use, you know, again, lead white is a transparent white. And so the way you kind of think about it is the color underneath plus the color that you glaze over it creates a third entity. So it's not like you're actually, when it dries, it's not going to look as at the same as the color that you're actually putting on. And so it's like, again, like it's, I almost call it causality. It's like, if you know what effect you're trying to create, you just need to analyze how to cause it to happen.
Yeah,
And
very
so,
good.
you know, what you do is based on what you're trying to accomplish, which is, again, when people talk about aesthetics and talk about style, the answer is always depends. What are you trying to do? What do you like? Subject matter. I don't know. What are you interested in? And here's the thing, like the society we live in right now, people like to talk about all the negatives, which I mean, there's a bunch of them, to be honest, but there's a lot of positives too. Like, for instance, with the internet and these, how easy it is to sort of find other people interested in similar subject matters. Like, you can have a podcast, or you can have, art that's literally made for your own sort of obsessive fandom with whatever genre it is, and you can find other people that are also hyper interested in that, and because you are so passionate about it, they will appreciate your work because they share your passion.
Yeah.
There's also a different path where like trying to reinvent the wheel and do something no one's ever done before, which is usually extra effort and might not get certain types of rewards, but that's its own sort of reward if you're passionate about it. So I would basically say that like tapping into genuine interest is a big advantage. Trying to imitate or cater to someone else's interest gets you in trouble because you don't know enough about the subject to fully fake it usually. And I found, like, from observation, one of the most powerful places you can be for success is to be genuinely passionate about something that has a large audience, a large passionate audience, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Um, Alistair Reinert on Instagram says, what medium do you use to dilute/thin the oil paint to create those beautiful washes? I'm drawn to those whimsical qualities in your work. Bravo.
Thank you so much. So the washes are both in acrylics in the prepping process, as well as the oleo, the oil paint thinned with oleo gel in the further stages.
All right. Do you have a favorite type of brush or palette knife, or shape of brush that you like to use?
Mostly rounds. I this again, this is like a great explanation. I was in art school. I thought the most sort of like coolest thing was square brushes or, square tip. Um, only used or flat tip. I only used flat tip brushes. And then I decided filberts were my thing. And then I only started using filberts. Now I primarily use rounds. So again, why? Because I eventually got into sort of precision. I also use this for bristle brushes. I use the side of the brush as well as the tip. So like the rounds to me are the most versatile. Um, so it's mostly rounds right now. But again, a tool is only as good as the purpose you're using it for and the intention behind the sort of use case. So it just depends on what you're trying to do, honestly. And like different brushes are going to be conducive to different things. A quick breakdown: I start a painting with bristle brushes, and the further I get into the painting, the softer the brush gets usually. So it's like if I'm doing very, very precise, um, finishing touches, it's usually either a sable or a synthetic. Um, I'm not starting a painting ever with a sable or synthetic because I want to move paint around and make long brush strokes. And so I need something firmer, and that's where the bristle comes in. So there is some sort of, separation of use case. But again, if I could do the same thing with a filbert versus a round if I wanted to. I used to do the same thing with a filbert. I just like rounds more now.
Yeah, very good. How do you check yourself as you're working? Like some artists, they use mirrors a lot, or they'll turn the canvas upside down, or they'll take photos on their phone, or they're sort of jumping back and forward, squinting all the time, or they'll get their friends in to give them critiques. What sort of things do you do?
Um, so I forget about the mirror, and I also like don't. It's not like habitual for me. I will, look at the painting upside down, like between my legs while stretching sometimes. Um, I have used phone stuff in the past. I don't know if it's the new iPhones or just the fact that I've gotten more particular, but like the phone changes so much about the painting that it's like not really great for certain things. I do sometimes actually like if I think a painting's done, like I'll do a reference photo or not reference, I'll shoot the painting, like I'll photograph it. And then once I photograph it, I'm not happy with it sometimes, so I'll go back to it. So that's like a final adjustment. But I just usually, torture myself by finding issues, and I'm really good at finding issues. So I'm never like, oh, that painting is great. I don't know what's wrong with it. It's usually like, hey, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. I don't like that. I don't like that. So it's like it's mostly like by the time I'm done sort of like tearing it apart and finding fault with it, it's finished.
Right.
Um, for but I would advise people use mirrors, use whatever, take pictures, look at it upside down, put it on its side, look at it in different lights. Like honestly, fresh perspective is great. Mornings are good for that. Like after you rest, just looking at it after like not looking at it for a while. If you're really stuck on a piece and you don't have a deadline, just set it aside, like literally turn it around so you don't see it for a week and then just look at it. A lot of my pieces, I will, if it's not on a short deadline, I will basically finish it about 80 to 90%, and then I'll just walk away from it for like weeks. And then I'll just look at it with a fresh eye and be like, this is finished. What did I wish I did that I didn't do? And then I'll just do that. There's something about calling something finished that makes you suddenly see a bunch of fault in it. So like I also trick myself into doing that. So like I do a lot of like self manipulation or self adjusting instead of using other tools for it. Again, it's a tendency I have. So like if you call like so I used to when I had a model posing from life, I would let's do a 3 hour session. I would call it a 3 hour session, and then I'd say, can you please stay for 20 more minutes because I need to change this thing. Because like once you're done, you can see something that you wish you did. And then I'd say another 20 minutes and another 20 minutes, and it would end up being 4 hours. But if I called it a 4 hour session, I still wouldn't get to all those things because there's something that your mind does after you don't have it, you're done. And then you're viewing it as its own entity versus how it came about. And so I think that transition from like how it came about to, okay, it is what it is. What is it? And what would you change if you could? And
Yeah.
somehow, even though it's really simple, but like saying that it's done and looking at it as if like, what would you change if you could? as if you can't, tricks your brain into seeing something that maybe it didn't spot before.
Yeah, that's brilliant. What's your varnishing preference?
I'm sorry, what was that?
What's your varnishing preference?
So I don't varnish all my pieces. Again, they're pretty thin, and I use like a lot of subtle layers, and I use enough medium to where like they're pretty easy to clean. Um, when I do use varnish, it's a Gambar,
All right.
and I've been using the satin Gambar, not the gloss personally, because I don't like glossy surfaces.
Okay. And what kind of lighting setup do you have in your studio?
So I shoot references primarily with natural light, and I use some natural light on my easel as well. But I also paint late, and I have two LED panels that are dimmable, so they go a little brighter and lighter, and they're daylight. Um, and so like I can move them on C stands and I set them up. However, my wife's also a photographer, so I use some like I use some of her lighting equipment, which is nice.
Okay. Very good. And did you say you when you were talking about what you listened to, is it just music or is it audiobooks, podcasts, that kind of thing as well?
Great question. It's all of it and at different stages. Like when I'm starting a painting, I won't let myself listen to an audiobook. I don't want to get too comfortable. As I'm saying, it's dance music. It's things that I actually flow to. It's things that I want to move to. And so it's like I run back and forth in the studio. It's like a very physical process for me. And I like it that way. So it's like that's my favorite. My favorite days of painting are the first days and the second days. Once the paint's fully dry, then it's a battle. But those first 2 days, it's like, it's so freeing almost. Like if I'm in a weird mood or whatever, and like I like start a new painting and I'm 2, 3 hours into it, my entire paradigm is shifted to where it's like, you tap into that flow state and everything else kind of goes away. And then, you start to, over analyze the piece, look at faults. Eventually it can become a source of anxiety. So I'm not saying all painting is, freeing, but there's something about like starting a piece for me, especially with music, running back and forth and like moving into it and like, yeah, it's very freeing. So at that stage it's just music. And then I start listening to audiobooks and podcasts a lot. So it's like if I'm finishing a piece, it's a lot of podcasts and audiobooks. But like again, I'll catch myself with headphones in and no sound for like hours too, because I just like, like once you like know what you're doing or whatever, like you forget to turn it on,
Yeah.
or a book ends or a podcast ends, like I'm not looking for something else. But when I'm starting, like if I'm like, working on texture, hair, or like getting into detail stuff, and it's the beginning of a day, I'll for sure listen to some audio stuff so that I don't overanalyze. I just kind of get to work.
Yeah.
Um, so different things at different stages based on what you're doing. Again, I told you most of my answers will be depends on the context.
Yeah. How do you name your paintings?
I don't know. Some of them I have the name before the painting. Most of them I name them after the painting's done. And I just keep cycling names until it sounds right. And I like it.
So you don't have like a, you don't get them from lyrics or poetry or anything like that. They just are in your head, is it?
Yeah. I actually do. I try not to copy names like someone else's titles. Like it's hard sometimes, like, because there's certain titles that I found that I'm like, that would be a good painting name. But like, I don't know. I try to name a piece more personally versus like that other title would work for it.
Yeah. 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 Sam Wilbraham again on Patreon says, I wondered how you came to your style and technique. What was the technique happened upon, or did you derive the method from another source of inspiration, e.g., pen and ink hatching? And how much experimentation did you do at the beginning of your career? So you've spoken quite a bit about that, but is there anything else you want to add to that?
Absolutely. I'll kind of touch again on the translating my drawings to paintings. And that's where like I did sort of get most free and comfortable first with charcoal and pencil and graphite. And, if you're in art school and like you're, getting into, I don't know, the study of how to's, you know, a lot of even like simplifying curves into straight lines, for instance, right? And then you extend those straight lines. And so my sort of ability to sort of throw straight lines around and build forms out of these lines, and I would like literally like aggressively draw, and eventually they'd be these very sort of tight drawings. And I really liked the way, and that again, that came over years of life studies. It was in school, and then I would teach charcoal drawing for like, I don't know, another 10 years. And so I would do weekly demos, and eventually the demos were probably like the best thing that I did for the time. And I was like, okay, because it's like it's consistent study. And again, you're also teaching, so you have to do a good job and you have to explain it well too. And like those demos over like 15 years had a quality that I liked to them. And then translating that and then evolving that is where a lot of my style came from. But the style that I had in the drawings was also my own style, basically. So it wasn't really derived from someone else. It's a almost like a distillation of my own brain. Like that's how my brain works. So
Yeah.
like and that's where like I really like try to tell people where it's like you have to, you want your style to be a natural sort of a natural progression of your own aesthetic and the way that your own brain works, right? Not, you don't want to imitate an aesthetic. Like who you are and how you want to approach things is eventually going to inform your process, right? How you do in what order, right? What you do and in what order. And your process you can adjust, right? And then eventually by adjusting your process, it should naturally create an aesthetic instead of like I'm going to imitate this thing. Like I'm going to be an impressionist. And so then you're actually creating a process to imitate an aesthetic instead of creating a process that's true to who you are. And then that will create its own aesthetic. And I think that's the most genuine and important sort of distinction.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good.
There's a big difference between like a piece and an actual sort of style or an aesthetic that carries through in like, not even just a body of work, but in like your entire work, right? Like you can figure out some sort of way to do something that looks somehow, but like if you want to consistently generate interesting imagery and interesting work, and you want that work to evolve, like it needs to have a strong foundation. And like designing your process that is something that's something, into a strong foundation that you keep evolving and building, I think is essential for the longevity and the evolution of the work. And that's where it's like it's different when you're actually producing work consistently than when you're thinking about it as a painting.
Yeah. 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 How do you deal with self doubt?
You just deal with it. Nah, listen, it's doubt. Let's call it doubt, because there's more things to doubt than self. Like there's self doubt, there's doubting the choices you've made, there's doubting the efficacy of your choices, there's doubting the outside world, there's doubting, the relevance of what you're doing. There's all kinds of doubt, right? And it doesn't really go away, to be completely honest. It's just more of those things like why some people admire art is like when you're just in there by yourself, like for years, working through self-doubt and trying to create something that is meaningful, that takes a bunch of effort that you might not get paid for. And it's like, yeah, that's like it's a weird paradigm. And doubt, imposter syndrome, it doesn't really go away. It's just one of those things that you work through. And yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's funny. People are like, when does like I've been asked like when does the imposter syndrome go away? It doesn't.
Yeah.
You just get used to it.
Yeah.
It can also
Sasha,
drive.
go ahead.
Sorry, it can also drive you to prove yourself. So it just depends on what your motivations are. Again, like if you're one of those competitive people that wants to prove themselves, you can use doubt to try to like motivate yourself. If you're not competitive and you just want to make something beautiful and it's not about proving yourself, then let things go and more focus more from like you can come at it from a much more zen perspective of like removing expectations and doing things purely for the sake of doing them. So as again, it just depends on who you are and where your doubts are coming from and what is going to sort of help you work well. And for some people, like I know a lot of professional, specifically in like the more traditional kind of representational genre. I know a lot of artists that are ex-athletes, ex-hyper competitive people that like actually love the discipline of learning the techniques because like it's very discipline intensive, like academic, specifically figurative drawing and painting. And I started from that perspective actually. Like I used to be hyper competitive, and I really liked the actual discipline and the difficulty of it. Like he's like learning how to do very difficult things is its own reward, right? Because it's like you have to build ways and systems, and like you have to, it's the repetition, the discipline, and like the ability to evolve a skill set that is difficult to come by is rewarding. Like I completely resonate with that. So it depends on where your doubt's coming from and where you want to take things. And that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, and that's where self knowledge comes into play as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Sasha Hill on Instagram says, greetings from Canada. What I would like to know is what is the significance of using bird imagery in your work? Thanks so much for the podcast, John. Looking forward to this. You're welcome, Sasha.
Good question. I like birds. I was actually making fun of myself. There's a Portlandia show where they have an episode where you put a bird on it. And it's just basically them like putting bird stickers on everything and like put a bird on it. And people were making fun of me, think put a bird on it. And I was like, it is funny. I love, again, it gets into personal preference. Like I love the texture of wings and feathers, just love it. I love the shapes that they make as they fly. I love the fact that I can compose them anywhere because they fly, right? So you can put them higher, lower, below a figure, above a figure, it doesn't matter. And again, it's like the metaphor as well of light and, kind of leaving the mortal or physical trappings and kind of ascending, things like that. So there's, again, it's a combination of interest and how well the interest has kind of worked in a pictorial sense for me because of how abstractly I can compose them.
Right. John Ramirez, Monaco in San Francisco says, I find your work beautiful and also haunting and mysterious. Aside from the theme of bird imagery, I've noticed that many times the figures look like they're behind a frosted window or a sheet of ice. Is this just a style you have created, or is there a meaning in this imagery?
It's both. And like a lot of the meaning in my work is kind of ephemeral. It's almost like on the emotional side. So I'm actually like, I'm happy that people are experiencing and resonating with that. It's, I like to evoke questions sometimes. I'm not like trying to give people answers with the work in a sense. Like it's like the curiosity, the mystery. Like I definitely find mystery very interesting. And so it's like, I do like paintings that are mysterious where you're actually like, it impacts you on an emotional level first, and then you try to figure out why. It's funny. It's even how I came to my sort of understanding of my own aesthetics is like you stop. An imagery hits you. An image hits you first. Like you don't know why, and then you kind of have to figure it out in a way. And so, like I like that my work sort of has that quality, and I work hard on sort of giving it that type of mystery. Um, and yeah, I guess that I hope that answers that.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah. Rod Hayslip, Rod Hayslip on Patreon. Thanks for the tea, Rod. Says, hi, John. Thanks for the wonderful podcasts. You're welcome, Rod. Hi, Daniel. Your art is full of intriguing narratives and delightful ambiguity. How has it been received? Specifically, what feedback and degree of acceptance have you encountered from women?
That's a funny and good question. My headphones might be dying, so if I cut out, it might be a little echoey for a second when I plug them in. Um, you know, I've never really got bad response from my work, and people are almost overly complimentary. I don't really overemphasize on that. I think that, there's a difference between like a kind of a generic compliment of like, oh wow, that's so cool. Which most people do, especially like in the US. Like people don't really tell you if they don't like your work. They just, kind of nod. So I've never really got a lot of like harsh criticism, other than from, immediate family, obviously. And but the way that I kind of gauge people's responses is a little bit more of like how like what they're how specific they are and like how perceptive they are and like how they're actually impacted by it versus saying nice things. Like I think it's great that people want to say nice things, but like I don't actually care that much. Like I'm way more critical about my work. Like I used to when I was younger, I'd almost get irritated with people for giving me the wrong compliment. Um, as I've gotten older, I've kind of moved past that. But like I still like I'm not like craving compliments that much. It's more of like I want to like the work, to be honest, because like I'm way more critical than most of the viewers are going to be, like by a large margin. I'm gonna plug this one in because it's dead.
Okay. And with relation to this thing about feedback from women,
I mean, okay, I'll be more specific. It's been very good. Like I've even had so many women write me and say like, "Who is she?" Because she reminds me of me, and I think that I try to convey women. I don't know from like again, there's like mystery, longing. Not I'm not really trying to sexualize them or desexualize them. It's not like again, it doesn't have to be women either. I just like the sort of they just kind of are conducive to the emotions that I'm trying to convey sometimes. And so like a soft strength, like the strength and surrender, almost the duality of softness and toughness in a way. And so it's like that, like I don't know, again, like the soft strength, I think is what I like. And that sort of, again, duality is a theme that I constantly am sort of interested in.
yeah,
And again, it's like it gets into like also like I said like personal preference. Like probably as I get older, I'm like even right now like I've been doing more self portraits and like bringing male energy into the paintings as well. Like most of my work has been done in like 5 6 years, and I was just like hyper interested in something. But like it's not necessarily going to be the only subject matter for the rest of my life. I think subject matter and interest need to evolve and change and things like that. So like I'm not like saying this is going to be me forever.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I saw that you used to fence competitively. Do you still fence?
No, but I want to. So my fencing coach, he was a friend of the family. He actually married me and my wife. Um, he just recently won. He's in his late 70s, but he just won the gold medal for the veterans epee fencing. So he's
Wow.
still going strong. And I'm still close with him and his kids. So I haven't been fencing, but I still have my gear. I'm still into it. It's been years.
Yeah. And what did you what well, like foil, epee, saber? Which what
Epee.
was your space? Epee was your thing, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we made fun of foil fencers, called them toothpick fencers.
Toothpick fences. Oh, okay, very good. Yeah, yeah. I used
But
to
yeah,
fence years ago.
oh, you did? Yeah. Were you a toothpick fencer?
I did. I think probably like most people, I had the three. I wasn't particularly good on any of them, but I had I did foil, epee, and saber.
Yeah. So my coach's coach, he was actually a military world champion in boxing. So like specific school that we were taught and did was like very sort of distance, tempo, and like second intention based. So it's like it's very close to boxing, and
Oh, okay.
I enjoyed the whole style of like it's like extended French grip. So it's like it's extra. You need extra strong hands, but like because your sword isn't as strong, but you're mostly playing with distance and timing and counterattacking like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
It worked with my personality.
epee is probably the most intense. They're certainly less flamboyant, but most intense.
Yeah, it's the most similar to actually fighting, least amount of rules,
Yeah, yeah,
which again
yeah.
I like.
Yeah. Um, okay, this is my desert island question. You're on a desert island. All your food and shelter are taken care of.
Uh-huh.
So you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to spend any time doing that. And you've got any kind of art supplies that you want, but no one's coming
Hmm.
and no one ever will come.
Okay.
Do you still paint, make art that no one is ever going to see except yourself?
Um, so probably more than anywhere else, because what else are you gonna do?
Okay. And do you think that what you make, the paintings that you make, would they be different from what you make now?
That's a great question. Probably. I would probably be doing a lot of landscapes and crab paintings. 1,001 paintings of the ocean. I'm actually being completely serious because you don't have photo reference, you don't have references, you don't have models. So you would for sure not paint as many figurative stuff. Like I might be doing like I've actually always wanted to do a self-portrait, call it narcissist, and do an actual self-portrait of my reflection out of water. But like, it'd be a good time to practice self-portraits in only using water as a mirror.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very good. Um, so with teaching, um, as you said, like we learn a lot when we teach, but you've been teaching for a long time now. Are you
That
still
doesn't
learning
mean I've
from it?
learned a lot. Yeah, I was gonna say that doesn't mean I've learned a lot. I am, and it's not even like necessarily new lessons. Like I've been really thinking about this a lot recently, where we don't learn things and like and remember that lesson in perpetuity and for the rest of our lives. Like I've been relearning so many lessons, and that's usually kind of my theme of like you almost like learn things again and again and again, and like until you can really apply them, and then you still are going to forget something else that you already knew after you're like hyper focusing on applying this other thing. So it's like a lot of the things that I find most valuable in teaching is almost like remembering the importance of things you've learned. And yes, you're learning new things too, and also there's like interpersonal elements, which I just like it's a great way to understand people and how things work as well. Like I'm definitely into again psychology, behavioral patterns. I like to pay attention to patterns in general and things like that. But it's the remembering the things that you may have forgotten and the importance of those things. Because like I think that most of us have like a pretty good compass and like a good innate understanding. Like people I think that they're less capable of like understanding the nuance of things than they actually are. And I think we all learn a lot of different lessons at a lot of different points in our life. It's the remembrance and the utilization of the lessons that we learn, I think, that we need to work on more and more. And so the remembering, the reminding, it's almost like and understanding at a deeper level is what I think is very, very helpful with teaching, especially even just seeing how the same things are going to like how many people have the same weaknesses or like the same issues, and how certain patterns or certain behavioral patterns are really beneficial and certain behavioral patterns are super damaging, at least for the intention that they're let's put it in the context of learning how to draw and paint, and stay away from like super broad human elements. But the you know, like for instance, like at some point in time, I was very happy that I could break rules, right? Like you learn, you get all these rules in school, and then like you're like, well, and a lot of my style actually came out of how I'm breaking those rules. But at the same time, you get too cocky. Hubris is like again a recurring theme in like my self criticism. But like you get a little too cocky, and you instead of like deviating from the rule, you try to completely abandon it, and then like you'll realize later that like nope, that was hubris, that wasn't the right move. And so it's kind of like it's nice to have certain truths that you're reminded of over a wide span of time in different aspects of your life, and that you can still see that those patterns do matter, and that there's like a certain, I think, humility that it comes out of teaching for long periods of time too, where it's like you're also subject to the same forgetfulness and the same sort of like I don't know misplacement of a lot of lessons that we all learn.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tell me about your Patreon. I know you mentioned it, but what? Just if someone's listening and they want to know more about it, or what's your intention with it?
Yeah, so my Patreon, I'm actually planning to double down on it a little bit more. I've been using it to I basically post like one or two videos a month usually, and they vary. So some of them were like online workshops that I used to have, and I'd record them and put them on there. Some of them are like full like 3 hour kind of painting demos. I've been doing like these shorter form videos recently where I more kind of explain what I'm doing in the studio, kind of the thought process behind the work, and kind of trying to diversify the content a little bit more so it's not like completely consistent. But it's basically a place where I am sharing things that I think are helpful for people in the arts. I touch on a bit of kind of like thought process and sort of like, what's going on in the studio. But the intention there is to sort of give interesting insights and sort of educational content, kind of based on more personal things that I do and like personal techniques and things like that.
Very good. If there was one main underlying theme to all your work, what do you think it would be?
Evolution.
Okay, very good. No question about that. um, Aaron Sidorenko in Canada and one of the winners of the John Dalton Gently Does It Art Prize. He says, palette and touch are remarkable, thin without feeling cheap on paint use. Is poetry a big influence in his work?
Writing is a big influence in my work, and poetic writing is a big influence. Poetry per se is not the genre that I devour the most, but I very much like poetic use of language, and that does impact my work, yes.
Okay.
It's specifically like, and that's why I'm saying like the worlds that we create, um, like a lot of the imagery that I generate and the imagine where my imagination goes is very much influenced by writing. I've read voraciously my entire life. That's all I did as a child.
Yeah. He also asks, what do you hate about art?
That's a good one. Um, all of it, sometimes. And none of it sometimes. It's honestly just more of like, I don't know. I think that's one of the appeals too that I find. It's like, like going through the pain and then coming out the other end. Um, it's against love hate, I call it. So it's not a complete hate, but there is definitely a lot of hate in the love hate aspect of it. Um, and but it's again, and that's kind of where I think it lends itself well to a lot of personal psychoanalysis because I almost get more frustrated with myself sometimes through art, where it's like, if you do the same thing, like as I'm saying, like when you're forgetting the lessons you've learned, like that's one of the things that I get frustrated about. And like I find myself doing that sometimes. And that's more of what I hate. Whereas if it's like a super elegant piece that came about like super easily, then I like love the aspect because it's my own performance that I'm, also very happy about.
Yeah.
So I think that the things I hate in art or at the time is more of a reflection about self-criticism than it is of the genre, to be honest. And I think that creatives have a hard time separating themselves from what they're doing from their creation. It's a little bit more personal than a lot of other sort of professions or disciplines. And so if the work is bad or if I'm not happy with it, and if especially if it took a while and I feel like, the last 50 hours made it worse instead of better, that's again frustrating. I wouldn't call it hate, but like it elicits negative emotions sometimes.
Okay. Um, Katie Fetch on Instagram says, what's your take on the future of artists and what AI means for us? And also, how do you stay inspired and keep learning and creating? So you've touched on all of that. So if it's like, no, I've already said that, that's fine. But if there's anything that you want to add to,
Yeah, I think I'll just quickly summarize. I think both of those are contextual. I think that art might change a bit, and like again, what do you call art as well? Like as a discipline, AI is not taking away anything from artists. As a let's say market size or market share or like jobs, for instance, like you could say that AI could affect some job positions or some use cases for creatives, which could be true. But then are there other use cases? And so it's like, again, I'm in the fine art space personally. So it's like, I don't think I'm as affected. If I was, let's say, a concept artist or someone working on like, digital work, it might be more personal. I still think that like, you know, there's room for the human element in art. I think it's the basis of art in the first place. So like I think that like eventually there might be more sort of use cases that are kind of explored by AI, but I don't think that it will supplement the human element at all.
No. Alison Ray says, "Hey Daniel, love your work. Any advice for emerging artists trying to establish themselves within the artistic community, in brackets outside of art school? I'm finally learning to face down imposter syndrome, but now I'm unsure of the logistics of how to make connections with fellow artists. Love your show, John. Thanks for all your hard work."
Yeah,
Thanks,
a good
Alison.
question. So yeah, let me know how you've learned to deal with imposter syndrome. I'll take notes. And
Oh,
in
I've got a great
terms
one on
of
imposter syndrome. I'll tell you mine.
what is it?
I don't resist it at all. When the
Kind
voice
of,
kind of comes and says, "Oh, you're just you're just a fake, you're just a phony," I don't fight it at all. I go, "That's right," and I'm going to ride this wave until someone else discovers it, and it just stops it dead.
totally. So I'm tongue in cheek with it. I make fun of myself. So it's kind of similar. So it's basically like my point is you don't have to eradicate a syndrome. It's just like one of those things that like reminds you sometimes. And it also, adds to introspection. So like maybe, you should do something a little more genuine if you feel like imposter, or maybe you should push yourself a bit harder or whatever. So it's like you use those like there's negative reinforcement as well as positive. So sometimes, you can utilize them. You can utilize some like a negative feeling for a positive effect. But in terms of community, I'm kind of a loner naturally, and I'm actually one of those people that like says no to a lot of invitations. That being said, I have seen the value of community, especially in the transition from school to producing, and I would just basically say that kind of just keep at it, and depends on what you're looking for. Again, as most of my answers are, it depends. If you want physical like community in person, I would look for life drawing groups if you're interested in again figurative stuff. You could even host one if you have a space for it. You can meet other people, little art schools or pod schools, like not necessarily the one you're going to, but like there's also like community centers, things like that where people go to. And then there's also obviously like groups, online groups that are pretty prevalent right now. There's different Facebook groups, there's different groups around artists or things like that. So it really kind of depends on what you're looking for. And I would just kind of try different stuff. But my biggest piece of advice is don't use the lack of something as an excuse to not move forward. Like while you're looking for, community and things like that, keep working by yourself. Even if you're missing that, don't stop your own development. Because I think that like it's really important to not use excuses and to keep pushing yourself. I also think it's important to prioritize and look for things if they are important for you. So they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, that's great advice. Um, Vladislava Pidlubna in Ukraine. Sorry if I just ruined your name there. Says, was it easy for Daniel to become a full-time artist when he got recognized at the first time? So when did you get recognized the first time? And what's the biggest challenge in your life and the lessons you learned from it?
So the answer to is it easy is no, period. Like it's if you want easy, don't try to become a professional artist. And I'm being completely honest. Like it's not like some sort of like you don't know how hard it is or whatever. Like listen, everything's hard. Most things of value are hard. Most other careers are hard too. Like I'm not like trying to say that this is like, I deserve any sort of like, extra respect or pity or anything like that. It's more of just saying like if you're looking for an easy path or like an asymmetric path of like a little bit of effort goes a long way, I wouldn't go for art, to be honest. Like there's so many other ways that are a little easier. Also, like if you're not worried about the discipline and the art form, and if you're just trying to go more of a for-profit model, the decision making is simpler and it's a little cleaner almost. Like you're not emotionally invested. You're not like trying to evolve a discipline as well as make money off of it. You basically can like start a business based on like, risk and value assessment. But like art is hard as a discipline. It's hard as a career, and both of those go hand in hand because you have to do both. So yes, it's difficult in terms of like when it stops being difficult, I'll let you know if it happens. And in terms of like getting your start, it's very gradual, honestly. Like I used to pay rent with competition winnings before I had a gallery life, funny enough. Like I would
Competition
again,
winnings.
I can't yeah, like I came from like a more technical background, so like there were these like competitions, like Art Renewal Center or you know, I don't even remember some of them. Like I used to enter a bunch of competitions in like the smaller representational kind of space, and I used to literally pay rent from competition winnings because like I wasn't selling paintings, so it just depends. And like, was that my start or was my start my gallery start? So it's like, it just depends on how you look at it. And I also like, was teaching, and then I would actually sell demos and like little sketches a lot more because it's lower price point. So like, again, you spend, a month working on a giant painting, like the price point's a lot higher. When you're starting out, it's sometimes easier to actually sell smaller, things for less. So depends on what you call a start. But like, I would say that like, if you want a career in art, and if you are willing to try to overcome the difficulties, first you have to accept that it's going to be hard. You have to, is the juice worth the squeeze? And that's subjective. So if it's worth the squeeze for you, start squeezing. And, you know, again, it depends. Like you do need to kind of understand the market a little bit. You understand what you're trying to do. You also have to develop your art form in itself. There's also like things like, uniqueness and voice, which also takes a bunch of time. So it's kind of all of the above. And you don't really want to get easily discouraged, but at the same time, if you are easily discouraged and if you're not sure, I mean, maybe don't be an artist. Like I'm not one of those people that's like, art's the only thing that I would be happy doing, or art's the only thing that you should do. Like I honestly think it's like a choice, and I think you should remember that it was your choice when you're in the trenches, and it kind of sucks for a while. So it's like, no one's making you.
Yeah, very good. Whenever I think about that, think about it's difficult to be a professional artist, and I always get this thing of, well, at least you're not a professional poet. I haven't a clue how that would be, and it's got to be harder.
Again, I don't even know. It depends. Like you can write one good book of poetry and then retire on it if it's published enough times.
Okay, well, I don't know any people who've done that. Do you?
Nope.
No.
I
Okay.
mean, I know of some.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the world of poetry, but it seems like
But
it's a different income model. They seem to, it seems to be held up by museums and cultural, people who want to
sure.
preserve poetry.
I'm playing
And
devil's advocate. I am not trying to say that, being a fine artist is harder than being a professional poet. I'm just basically saying that like it's all hard, right? You're not going into poetry I like did I modeled out the most sort of the easiest and most lucrative professions, and I arrived at poetry. Like
yeah,
that's not really what's going to happen. And but at the same time, I would have to say that like I think that like niche markets and sort of like those kind of like different genres, it's more possible to do almost anything right now if you can find a group of people that appreciates it and a supportive kind of community. So it's like,
yes,
and what I mean by that is like you have more access to people than ever before. And you can do something. And if you're passionate about it, and if you keep doing it and you do a good job and you work your ass off, like there's more possibilities. Like poetry, as an example, like you could have a Patreon where you publish poetry and just try to have people like, how many fantasy authors have a Patreon and actually making really good money because they wrote free novels, free web novels, and then they release like chapters early on their Patreon. And they have thousands of patrons because they're supporting an author that they like because they've read hundreds of hours of their, fiction. And so I'm saying is that like it just depends on how you look at it. And a lot of this genre came out of people like making no money. And so it's like what I've seen a lot these days is like if you're creating content, like let's call art and poetry and writing all content, right? If you develop an audience that is interested and grateful for the content that you're creating, there's a business model eventually, long term.
Yeah. Yeah. How have you got on with the art business? You mentioned it a little bit, but some people have love stories, some people are horror stories. How have you got on?
Listen, I think I almost answered it already. Like, it's hard, and like it depends on what you're doing. Like, I went into the gallery space more. Pros and cons again. Like, I sometimes feel that I overemphasized on kind of status versus other things a little bit. I'm kind of moving away from status a little bit, but I like the fact that the fine art model allows you to really push yourself and create the best pieces you can possibly create, which is what I was after, and that's why I chose that path. Versus, let's say, like doing illustrations for a subject or for a use case, versus like the purism of like personal evolution and creating the best work you can possibly create. um but again, it makes certain things harder for sure. And again, I would say that, like, in general, if you are unsure if you want to be an artist or not, and you are more focused on you know building a business or making money, choose another path.
Very good. What sort of price range are your paintings selling for these days?
Depends on size. So it's generally around like 3K to larger ones around 20. But like, a medium-sized painting would be around 7 to 10, 6 to 10.
Okay. Um, do you have a big art dream you'd like to achieve before you die?
Um, yeah, I just to be okay with what I've done, honestly. Like, it's like one of those things where there is no like singular project that I have like a obsession with. It's more of just, when you look back and if you die of natural causes like sudden death, like, you don't have to worry about it, right? Because you don't have time to think. But if we're talking about at the long, ripe old age of 80 something, and I'm looking back at my life, I would like to just like what I've done and like myself, honestly. The self liking self, I think, is like the most important, and just accomplish something. For me, it's not the specific thing, it's just doing a good job. I mentioned that earlier, and like, I chose a path, and so I kind of want to be personally happy with my accomplishments more than anything. It's not like reaching some sort of external goal.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Guaranteed success.
You don't know me. You don't know how critical my brain is, and that's what I'm saying. Like, it's one of those things where it's like it is a kind of a vicious cycle. I think I need to basically be a little kinder and more to myself anyway, and like more focused on the I remind myself a lot, but like more focused on the journey and just being grateful that I get to do so much introspection, so much personal evolution through my practice, and just kind of run with it, and be happy about it.
Yeah. Well, why I said guaranteed success is number one, it's not reliant on anyone else. So that's, very important. And
Right.
then
Then I also
also,
know who to blame.
yeah, but also, you were saying like when you reach your 80s, by the time you reach your 80s, you'll have worked out, you'll have the critical stuff that will have worked itself out. You can tell me if it doesn't, okay? You can get in touch when
I
you're in
will.
your
I will.
80s. Let me
I
know. I'm
totally
still
will,
around.
for sure.
Okay, this is my last question. I ask this to everyone who comes on the podcast. If there's one thing you could pass on to future generations, what would it be?
Generations of artists, or just people in general?
Either or. Take your pick, whatever speaks to you.
Common sense isn't so common, and like basic truths seem to be so commonly avoided and just not paid attention to. Just kind of like trust yourself and like try to do a good job, and just be humble but confident. I don't know. It's like not one thing. It's more of, again, approach. I think the biggest thing I would say is how to approach things, and like I think that the way we approach things and the way we frame things in our own minds is very, very important. I think that like people want either instant gratification or a lot for very little. And I think that, like, the journey is very important. And a lot of times, like, at least personally, Usually when I'm like overly fixated on a goal and then I get it, I'm almost depressed afterwards because it wasn't that fulfilling. But when I'm focused on the journey and, the day to day and personal evolution, then it's much more rewarding. So, personal growth or daily evolution over time is very powerful. And I find that daily evolution over time is more powerful than a lot of the alternatives of like sacrificing the day for some sort of future accomplishment. And I would actually say that like if you take daily evolution and you multiply that by time, it will lend itself to more accomplishments than the alternative a lot of the times.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, it's been lovely chatting with you. I think your
Likewise.
paintings are fantastic. I think you managed to, they're very, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like they're like wrapped in cellophane. That's the way I kind of feel when I look at them, not in a crinkly kind of way, but there's so many beautiful layers there, both physically, like in the painting themselves, but also in what's evoked in me when I look at them. There's, I can register that there's a lot going on inside me when I look at your work, and it's not all the same kind of thing. It's like there are different elements. They're all very beautiful to look at. I haven't seen anything that I didn't find beautiful to look at, but there are shadows, emotional shadows, dark areas. There's a lot of complexity and texture in what happens inside me when I'm looking at them anyway. And I think that's amazing that you're able to do that. I mean, technically, you're amazing. It's amazing to watch you. Like, if you're listening, definitely go and have a look at some of Daniel's time lapses, because the way you put it together and the way you kind of enfold the layers into each other is remarkable. And what you can do with the squeegee is pretty amazing as well.
Thank you. Appreciate it, John. And thanks for having me on.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. Your paintings really seem to be a product of, you're quite an unusual kind of person in your focus, in your intensity. I would have hated to have met you fencing, because you would have slaughtered me, and regardless of your skill level, because of I've fenced people like you before who are very one-pointed, meaning, in their focus, and they're very difficult to beat, and it's it's like you funnel so much into your paintings of your very multi-layered kind of the person who you are, and that's fantastic as well. So yeah, it's been great chatting with you, getting to know you a little bit better. Okay, well, I keep in touch with everyone for Great. Zoom, tea, or whatever, so I'm sure we'll keep in touch, but we'll say goodbye for now.
Love to. Thanks for having me on, John. It was a great conversation, and I can't wait to have tea with you via Zoom.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
I've never felt this good in my entire life. Make me some spaghetti.
Actually, I'd prefer a cup of tea. A cup of tea would be lovely. So yeah, just a little reminder, mainly because every second or third person who becomes a patron has got in touch with me and said, you know what, I've been listening to your podcast for ages, and I didn't become a patron, not because I don't have the money, not because I don't think it's great, I just didn't get around to it. So this is a little friendly reminder that if you'd like to be a patron, you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, go to patreon.com/John Dalton, gently does it, all one word, or follow the link in the show notes to become a patron. I would really appreciate it if you could do that, particularly if you've been meaning to and you just haven't got around to it. It would be great. It would mean a lot to me. All right. Thank you. Bye.
We are the Argyle Pimps. So buy us a drink. We're better than you thought, but not as good as we think. We are the Argyle Pimps. So buy us a drink. Come on, buy us a drink. Come on, buy us a drink. We are the Argyle Pimps. So buy us a drink. We're better we think. We are the Argyle